Okay, good morning, everyone. I just lost my Zoom screen. There it is. My name is Amanda Lockett, and I am one of the co-conveners of this conference, Childhood Disability Without Poverty, a National Discussion. I am a member of the BC team of Disability Without Poverty. I have shoulder length brown hair. And as host of today's event, I am desperately trying not to look concerned about everything going smoothly. I am very happy to welcome you all here. Before we begin with the conference, I'm going to go over our accessibility components and a brief agenda for today. Please note that during the presentation and panel discussions, we will have the chat closed to the public as it can be disruptive to other participants. If you experience any technical difficulties, you'll be able to send a chat message to the hosts and panelists. For all questions that you have, please put those in the chat box as well, which is usually at the bottom of your screen. We greatly encourage you to share your questions, and we'll be responding to as many as we can live during our conversation today. Our meeting today features simultaneous English and French translation, LSQ and ASL interpretation, and English and French captioning. So please take a moment to adjust your settings as appropriate for you. First, please select your preferred language, English or French. You do this by selecting the interpretation option on your Zoom menu. Once you select this option, you will not need to change language settings again during the presentation. You must select a language, even if you want to hear this presentation in English. If you're using a mobile device, such as a phone or a tablet, you can find language interpretation options under the More tab. For those who require ASL or LSQ interpretation, we'll be spotlighting those components throughout the presentation. Please make sure your meeting view is speaker view so that you always see these on your screen. To enable captions, select the captions option on your Zoom menu. If you'd like to adjust the size and placement of these captions, you'll need to go into your Zoom accessibility settings. For those of you who'd like to access French captions for the event today, or would like to access the English captions on a different browser, please click on the link that's been put into the event chat box to access these online. If we can support you throughout this presentation, please send us a message in the chat and someone will assist you. For any additional settings, go to your personal Zoom account settings or your audio settings for further customization. So to summarize our accessibility options, please select your language using the interpretation option, enable captions if required, and finally, make sure to share your questions and comments in the chat. Team members are on hand to help you with any technical difficulties you may be experiencing. We will be recording today's session in the speaker view. This conference became quite a bit bigger than we had initially dreamed, so we have muted all of the guests. So please use that chat function for questions and comments, and we will be using some Menti polls throughout the conference that will be explained shortly. I would now like to introduce Kirsten Dumont, our knowledge keeper, who is here to open the day and open the conference for us. Kirsten is a passionate and caring young woman and a proud band member of the Algonquins of Kitigan-Zibi. She's been awarded 3 times for her work within and outside Indigenous communities. Kirsten has won the CBC Trailblazer Award, the June Gervin Award, and the Youth Ottawa RBC Spirit of the Capital Take a Stand Award. She's taken part in sacred walks to protect the water and has spoken on Parliament Hill about climate justice and human rights. She has spoken in the House of Commons about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls genocide in Canada. Kirsten has worked with organizations, churches, and schools such as the Ottawa Catholic and Carleton School Boards, Project of Health, the Child Welfare League of Canada, UNICEF Canada, and the Kitchissippi Church and Woodruff Church, all while pursuing her post-secondary education. My goodness, do you have time for sleep? Kirsten works as a strong role model for other students who have fallen through the cracks of the mainstream colonial education system. She's an advocate, educator, and mentor to her family and community alike. We are honored to have you join us, Kirsten. Welcome.
Miigwech, Amanda. I'm also a soon-to-be mother of one, and that's something that I'd like to share a bit about today as well. Through going on this journey of motherhood, I could have never understood the impact that this would have on me, as I'm a young person and a young individual, but through my pregnancy, there have been a multitude of complications. And understanding how these complications and these possible disabilities that my child will have to grow into has been something that I don't think any parent is necessarily ready for or able to fully understand. Through this journey, the understanding of Indigenous points of view when looking at disability is what has helped me along this way. Understanding that my child is not categorized by the disability that they hold within them, but how this disability allows them to move through the world in a different ability, in a different form, in a different structure, in a different shape. My child, although will be walking through life not the same as it helps me to understand the little things that my child will soon learn to love, grow into, and simply thrive within. These disabilities that we look at when we view children are not things that stop them from taking on the world or loving Mother Earth and simply understanding their connection to this planet, but it allows them to obtain an even deeper connection than somebody like you or I, or people who do not necessarily carry these things. They have to understand how to walk through life in a different format. They have to understand how to uplift themselves, how to be courageous, how to be brave, how to be resilient, as Indigenous people always have been. That resiliency, that strength, that courage, it's a phenomenon that many people have never been able to experience before. The life that my child will grow into and grow up within is going to be one filled with beauty, filled with positivity, and filled with being restructured. Because the way that I view the world is going to be very different than the way my child views the world. This will have an impact on not only my child, but myself as well. Having to restructure our imagination as to what life is deemed to be within a colonial point of view, having to understand that these things that we deem as disabilities are not disabilities, but they are abilities to walk through life in different formats, in different ways, in different platforms. That within itself is true beauty. I think a lot about the youth that I've come into contact with, the kind of youth that my son will be, the kind of person that I am, and the kind of family that I come from. We all struggle with different things. We all have to overcome different imbalances within our life. But this doesn't mitigate our strength that we hold within us. Sometimes I think that people who have to overcome even larger barriers are even stronger than myself, because it takes true pride, true strength, and true understanding of the world to move forward in a calm, sensitive, and simply compassionate point of view. Equality and equity and inclusion is not to stop at people like each and every one of us, but it is to ensure that the children are being included within these kinds of conversations, within these kinds of viewpoints and systemic approaches. I can only hope that within 22 years, it is not only me having the ability to open up conferences like these, but my son's ability as well to speak his truth, to understand his truth, and to help you all learn alongside him as he learns alongside the world. The way that we upbring our kids and the way that we raise them is what's going to impact them on a generational basis. The love that we give to our children, that inclusion that we give to our life is what will be sacred, simplicit, and understanding. As we end off in this opening, I would like to share a poem. This poem was written by Chief Dan George. The beauty of the trees, the softness of the air, the fragrance of the grass speaks to me. The summit of the mountain, the thunder of the sky, the rhythm of the sea speaks to me. The faintness of the stars, the freshness of the morning, the dewdrop on the flower speaks to me. The strength of the fire, the taste of the salmon, the trail of the sun, and the life that never goes away, they speak to me, and my heart soars. I want you to take these words today, and I want you to take the message from that poem and understand that the best inclusion and equality that you can give to your child is a happy life. No matter whether you come from poverty or from riches or from wealth, the love that we give to our children will be intergenerational. You will not only teach your child how to walk through life, but you will teach your child how to love everybody that they come into contact with. Please remember that as you go through this conference. Chimigwech for having me here today and for allowing me to open this space. It is such a pleasure, especially with everything that I have going on within my own little family that will soon to be. Thank you so much.
Kirsten, thank you so much for those really beautiful words. Thank you for opening our national discussion on childhood disability, family poverty, and health outcomes. And congratulations on your upcoming venture into motherhood. We truly wish you all the best. And you know, there's lots of support even here for you, should you choose to reach out for it. There's a lot of parents on here. Yeah, congratulations and thank you. I'd now like to introduce Rabia Khidr. Rabia is dedicated to equity and justice for persons with disabilities, women, and diverse communities. Rabia most recently served as board member of Accessibility Standards Canada and the Minister's Disability Advisory Group, and previously served as a commissioner for the Ontario Human Rights Commission. She is the National Director of Disability Without Poverty and CEO of Dean Support Services. A founder of Race and Disability Canada, she is also a board member of the Muslim Council of Peel and a board member of the Federation of Muslim Women. A motivational speaker and a documentary commentator, Rabia has campaigned in municipal elections and served as a city councillor in Mississauga. Rabia has received numerous... Oh, I said something wrong. She's laughing.
I didn't serve. I ran. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
All good.
All good. Rabia has received numerous awards for humanitarian services, including a Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. Rabia holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Toronto and a Master of Arts from York University. Rabia?
Thank you very much, Amanda. I really appreciate it. I need to shorten my bio. I don't like lengthy introductions, so my apologies there. I'm speaking to you. It's my honor and privilege to speak after Kirsten and her extremely powerful, heartfelt reflection and thoughts in moving us into this space together today. I honor and appreciate the original inhabitants of Turtle Island, the ancestors who have preserved and protected this vast land from sea to sea to sea that we have colonized and settled on. I wouldn't be who I am today if I did not have the honor and privilege of growing up in this land. I speak to you from Mississauga, Ontario, Canada, most recently the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. I am a woman with a disability who grew up in a family of disabled siblings, including individuals with intellectual disabilities. So close to Mother's Day, I honor our mothers and their resilience and their commitment to raising us children with disabilities to be able to go through this journey of life with its barriers, trials, and triumphs. So I first and foremost honor our mothers, and I appreciate the initiative of our parents gathered here today, and in particular, Amanda Lockridge and Brenda Lenihan, who have been the backbone and the visionaries organizing this conversation that we will be having today and tomorrow. This conference, as Amanda said, was envisioned and has really grown into something much bigger because the topic is so important and there's so little conversation tackling and the barriers that parents face, the struggles that parents face in terms of their financial capacity when they are full-time caregivers of children with disabilities. This is a tremendous conversation that is often absent in poverty space and in disability space. This intersectionality is key for us to dialogue on today and going forward. This is a start of a conversation that requires more data collection, research, and discourse to bring about the changes that we need to improve quality of life of families with children with disabilities. No child, no individual should have to live in poverty in this country, especially when they have a disability. Disability Without Poverty is a national movement spotlighting disability poverty and empowering us to take action. C-22, the Canada Disability Benefit Bill, is in the Senate right now. It is going to be voted on next week in the Senate with its proposed amendments brought forth by the Social Affairs, Science and Technology Committee, or SOCHI, that has brought those amendments forward in hopes of making improvements to the letter of the law in the bill. It will be voted upon by our senators who hold the responsibility of sober second thought. We are appealing to them to deal with this bill swiftly, and let's get it to royal assent because poverty does not wait. We want this bill passed by the end of June so that we can work hard to ensure that the money reaches the people that it needs to reach. We are intending to be an integral part of the conversation that is going to shape the regulations. And as we move forth with this journey, we have launched a postcard campaign calling on the finance minister to budget the benefit. We need your support in this postcard campaign. For more information, please visit disabilitywithoutpoverty.ca. Please follow us on our social media and continue to raise your voice and share your stories on disability poverty. Although this benefit is focused on working age Canadians living with disabilities, living in poverty, we know that there's a lot more work to do. And that's why we are having this conversation. We are supporting this conference today with our parents parent leaders, Brenda and Amanda, to ensure that we raise the fact that childhood disability poverty also is equally important. We also know that seniors living in poverty who have disabilities face exacerbated financial barriers due to their disability. We know that the Canada Disability Benefit deals with the population of working age Canadians with disabilities who are the most impoverished across the board and have no supplemental income beyond any provincial programs that they may be accessing in some provinces. Let's fill this one huge gap and continue advocating for the full inclusion of every individual, child or adult with disability, and their families. We thank sponsors, funders, supporters, attendees, and speakers. We thank you for your commitment and participation. And I wish you an incredible 2 days of conversation, of content that educates and informs and enlightens you, that raises awareness, that empowers us to continue the fight for disability justice and for the Canada Disability Benefit. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rabia, and thank you for those words. We deeply and truly appreciate the substantial time and effort that you have personally put into making the Canada Disability Benefit a reality for the 1.5 million disabled Canadians living in poverty. This conference really began as a conversation, a dream between Brenda Lenihan and myself, as we tried to imagine what we might learn if we could get medical clinicians, policy experts, economists, service providers, researchers, and families into the same space to talk on equal footing about childhood disability, family poverty, and health outcomes, to see if we could find a way to instigate some kind of systemic change in federal, provincial, and local policy. We made our very best effort to include speakers from coast to coast to coast who come from diverse cultures, genders, and socioeconomic backgrounds, and to find a balance of family voices, which include experts who wear multiple hats, including that of parent. We made a real effort to reach beyond our regular networks with the hope to open new doors and elevate voices that are not often heard. We apologize to those we could not invite to speak today. This already grew beyond our initial dreams. The work of creating this event has already been exceptionally valuable for us, as many of our goals have been realized in the process of gathering people together today. These panels will feel fast. There's not a lot of time to dive deep in many ways because there is truly so much ground to cover. We hope that micro examples can talk to a bigger picture. We expect there will be more questions than answers. And our hope is that this is the first of many conversations that can branch out of this. We would love to inspire different working groups to come together and dig deep into how we can influence policy changes. We've set these 2 days primarily as a series of panels, each addressing a specific theme. We have 2 breaks built in each day for people to move their bodies and get some food, take a walk, or chat. We remind everyone that the idea for this event is to have a somewhat informal discussion amongst allies who want to raise issues, suggest solutions, and change policy. So please knit, doodle, cuddle your child or a pet, snack as needed, take care of yourself as we dive into these topics. And I'm going to again remind people that we would love to see your beautiful faces. So please feel comfortable turning on the camera if you are comfortable doing that. Anything that you put into the chat will be anonymized for later use, unless you specify otherwise that you would like your name included with a particular quote or comment. And in that case, please provide your name. If you need help or have questions, our technical team is monitoring the chat and will be able to assist you to the best of their ability. You can find the schedule on Disability Without Poverty's website. There will be a link in the chat. I want to thank everyone who has come together to make this event possible, in particular our financial supporters, including Sick Kids Foundation, who, apart from the government, is the largest funder in child health in the country, Kids Brain Health Network, Spark BC, and Dean. We thank our speakers and creators, our volunteers, our behind-the-scenes teams at Plan Institute, and Disability Without Poverty. We thank Amanda Fenton of Amanda Fenton Consulting, who has been a calming, organized presence throughout the development of this event. Amanda works in participatory group process design and facilitation for both online and in-person gatherings, and I will let her introduce herself now. Amanda.
Thank you, Amanda L., or as we affectionately call you, ALO, which I will probably accidentally say several times throughout the conference. Hello, everyone. This is Amanda F. speaking. I welcome the pronouns she, her, and hers. I am a white woman with short, usually say brown hair, but there's lots more sparkle coming in these days to my short brown hair. And during this conference, as we were in the planning for this, it was so important to Amanda and Brenda and others to really welcome your perspectives, your thoughts and ideas. And we're a big group. You know, how can we do this? There are just too many of us to be able to hear from you individually. So to ensure that we can receive as many contributions from you as possible over these 2 days, we're going to be using a tool called Menti. You're also welcome to use the Zoom chat as well. But just a couple of good things to know about using Menti. It is an online tool. Your contributions in Menti are anonymous, so we won't know who has contributed which comments. If you want to add your name, you're welcome to, but it is anonymous how the tool works. But your comments will be visible to us, so they kind of come in behind the scenes, and we'll be able to briefly share some of the contributions that are coming in. And how it works is that you will access the Menti questions from a link that we put in the Zoom chat, and I think one has already arrived there. And just a note that because of there's a character limit inside Menti, we don't have the French translation of the question displayed in Menti, but you will see the French translation in the Zoom chat. And you can respond to the Menti in French. So even though it shows in English, please use it if you are a French writer as well. So we have our first welcoming poll of the session, just to get us a little bit comfortable. I'm just going to screen share for a moment how this works. If you're already clicking through the link in the Zoom chat, that's fine, but I'm going to bring it up on my screen here. And the first question is, where are you Zooming in from? We are a coast-to-coast audience. For myself, I'm in New Westminster, British Columbia, New Westminster. Don't worry about spelling. BC, I'm still spelling it wrong. And then you click submit. And then we have a second question with this opening Menti poll, which is, how are you connected to this conference topic of children with disabilities? You might be a parent of children with disabilities. Perhaps you're a researcher. Maybe you're involved in a community organization. Maybe you have multiple connections. And so just inviting to hear from you, how are you connected to this conference topic of children with disabilities? And in this particular, you can submit multiple answers. So if you share a little bit and then remember another connection, you can submit more. And just to absolutely reiterate, if Menti is not working for you, please use the Zoom chat. Both are very valid ways of contributing. We'll make sure we aggregate both of those. So I'm just going to, maybe we'll just post that link one more time in the Zoom chat. We'll just make sure it works. Some folks are saying it's no longer active. Oh dear, let's just double check here what's going on. It should still be working, but quick troubleshooting on the fly here. So this is our welcoming poll, open-ended. We'll just make sure that that is still active for everyone. We'll give another moment. And again, if the chat isn't working or the Menti link, please use the Zoom chat. And I'm just going to repaste in the link. This is why we do opening polls, is just to make sure that, hey, are things working the way we want them to? And I'm just seeing some lovely contributions in the chat. I'll just read in a few. We have some folks from Ottawa, Fort McMurray, student and parent, a mother of kids with neurodevelopmental disabilities, some folks working in Vancouver with a financial empowerment program, from London, Ontario, speech language pathologist, wonderful. Just terrific to see your welcoming arriving in, and also a clear message for me that we have a little tech gremlin appearing with this welcome poll. So I'll do some adjusting behind the scenes to make sure it's all working for the rest. But I'm going to pause there for a moment because I have another dear friend and colleague that I want to invite into the Zoom spotlight here for who will be with us over these 2 days as well. And that is Kelly Foxcroft-Poirier, who you'll see now on the screen for those of us that see visually. Kelly is waving. Kelly, amongst many talents and roles, is here with us to do some graphic recording. Kelly will be listening to the panelists as well as your contributions in Menti, in the Zoom chat, and creating some visuals. So Kelly, I'll just briefly hand it over to you to introduce yourself and just share how folks can follow along with what you're up to.
Plus Axmakuas, Oklama Chiisunka, Sisha Aksup, Histakshitlatsumaas. So that is my traditional language. I'm calling you from unceded Sishat territory on the west coast of Vancouver Island, here in Canada. I said good morning, but I guess I should say Klus Akma Upwin. Good afternoon for those in different time zones. Thank you for having me in this work of graphic recording, of creating some visuals of deep listening, and then honoring the contributions and bringing them together in a way that brings us beyond words and brings us into storytelling, which is such an important piece of accessibility and connection. I am also a disability mom. I have all 3 kids, neurodiverse, and my youngest has intellectual disability. And the only thing I can say is I'm just a humble learner and a humble listener and a humble follower of the brilliance of human potential and how every day I learn how immeasurable it is. So I'm truly honored to be here to contribute, to hold each of you up. Our word for that in my culture is ichayapstah. I'm also currently recovering from concussion. So what you will see in my little square is a fairly tan female identifying human with glasses with tape on them to help accommodate some of my brain limitations and needs. So definitely a humble learner about what it is to walk through the world a little more than dysregulated lately. I take that as the gift that it is. So thank you for the gift of being with you. And along the way, I'll be drawing and capturing some words and some images. And if we have the chance and the time, I'll tuck in a little bit of a tour for you with my computer and describe what those images are and some of the words that are coming that link to those images. So wish me luck, because I never really know how it's going to go. And isn't that the life of a disability mom? Chew.
Thank you, Kelly. And I think I turn it back over to Amanda Lockitch. Over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Kelly, and good luck, Kelly. As you say, we definitely will pop in to see the good work you're doing there. It already looks exciting, so I can't wait to get a close up as we move through. So we're going to move to our first section today, where we are learning from Northern and Indigenous experiences. So rather than a unified panel for this, we have 3 segments in which we explore barriers, potential solutions, and policy recommendations that have and could contribute to a more inclusive and equitable future for the health and well-being of all disabled children living in Canada. We begin with a presentation on Jordan's Principle by Jennifer King of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. Jennifer holds a master's degree in social work with a focus on Indigenous methodologies and Indigenous perspectives on policy and practice. You can read more about her substantial accomplishments on the DWP Disability Without Poverty site, linked in the chat, where you can find our overall schedule and the bios of all of our speakers. Jennifer, welcome, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
So, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer King. I am joining you this morning from unceded Algonquin territory, also known as Ottawa. So it is the afternoon here, and I am very pleased and humbled to be joining you. As was mentioned, my family comes from the Wissahickon First Nation. So I am Anishinaabe of mixed descent, and I've been very lucky to work at the Caring Society for about 10 years now. And during that time to have worked closely on something called Jordan's Principle, which I'm here to speak to you about today. Now, I will say that I am someone with privilege and I'm a learner, as was said. I'm a humble learner. Of the way I have failed to communicate in a manner that it works for everyone. Please, someone flag that for me. I would very much appreciate it. So I see in the chat that someone is going to share the slides for me, which I very much appreciate, because I'm always one of those people on Zoom who never knows how to share their screen, and it's always very embarrassing. So please, Michelle looks like is messaging me. If you would mind sharing, that would be very appreciated. In the meantime, while that's happening, I will say that I wanted to start actually with a little video about Jordan's Principle. It is a video, we call it the Jordan's Principle Public PSA, Public Service Announcement. And this one we actually had done with young people doing the captioning, the American Sign Language captioning. So I'm going to let them take it away as the first introduction to Jordan's Principle for those who might not have heard about it. Well, there we go. And Jordan's principle, Put Children First, is also the title of my talk this morning. If you want to advance the slide. Oh, I guess we need to advance it again. I want now to talk to you about who Jordan was and about his legacy. So if I was more techie, or if I was in a room, I might say, how many people have heard of Jordan's principle before? But since I don't know how to do that here, I'm just going to start at the beginning. And for those who might have heard it before, I thank you for your patience. So up there in the corner, we have Jordan. Jordan River Anderson was a little guy from the Norway House Cree Nation. He was born with complex medical needs, and so for the first couple of years of his life, he had to stay in the Winnipeg Children's Hospital to get the care and support he needed. At the age of 2, his medical team said that he could go home. And it was at that time that the province of Manitoba and the government of Canada started arguing over who was going to pay for that at-home care that he needed. And the only reason this argument happened at all was because Jordan was a First Nations child. And as you may know, healthcare normally funded by the province, services for First Nations normally funded by the federal government. And so both of those levels of government decided that, neither wanted to pay for the care Jordan needed. And so he actually stayed in that hospital for another 2 years, completely unnecessarily, no medical reason for him to be there, other than the fact that neither level of government wanted to fund the care that would have been provided to any other child as a matter of course. So very sadly, Jordan actually passed away at the age of 5 in that hospital, having never left, never having the chance to live in a family home. So following that, Jordan's family, and that's a picture of his dad down there, very courageously came forward and said, we don't want what happened to Jordan to happen to any other First Nations child. And the thing that you need to know is that the situation that Jordan found himself in, although particularly tragic in its outcome, in terms of him never leaving that space, was not unusual. This sort of jurisdictional dispute between federal and provincial governments happened and does continue to happen quite frequently. At the time of Jordan's passing, in 2005, a study was done that found no less than 393 other children in a situation like Jordan's, where they needed services, but neither level of government was willing to pay. So Jordan's family came forward and they said, we want to put his name to a child first principle to ensure that nothing like this happens to another child. If you want to advance the slide. So in December of 2007, the House of Commons actually had a motion presented, which asked the government to support Jordan's principle, to support this idea that First Nations kids should get the help they need when they need it. That motion passed unanimously by all members of Parliament. All parties stood up and said, yes, Jordan's principle is something that we believe in. Unfortunately, almost immediately after that motion was passed, the bureaucracy of the government set about narrowing that vision, the spirit and intent of that principle, to the point that when people sought help, nobody qualified. And in fact, even though people knew that Jordan's principle had passed in the House of Commons, no one really knew what to do to access that kind of, Jordan's principle support. So Canada's failure to implement Jordan's principle, to learn from Jordan's story, became part of a human rights complaint that the organization I work for and the Assembly of First Nations had filed also in 2007. In 2016, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal found that Canada was racially discriminating against First Nations kids by underfunding child welfare on reserve, and that's a whole other piece that we don't have time to talk about today, but also racially discriminating in their failure to implement Jordan's principle and to do things differently for First Nations kids needing help. As a result of that tribunal ruling and actually 24 additional rulings by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. We don't have time to talk about the whole history of the case today, but I will let you know that that case is ongoing. I think, how many years has it been now? 13, 14, 15, 16 years. We're still at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal trying to end the discrimination and make sure that it doesn't happen again. But some progress has been made as a result of those rulings. Today, we are very happy to know that 2.56 million products, services, and supports for First Nations kids have been approved by Canada through Jordan's Principle. So all that to say, Jordan's Principle, I think, is not yet at the place that the family intended, but we are getting there, and kids are getting services and supports as a result. So for anyone in our group who is First Nations or has a First Nations child in their circle, I want to spend a little bit of time talking to you now about how you can access this support. So next slide. In doing that, I want to kind of talk about some of the things that, if you have heard about Jordan's Principle, some of the things that are correct and some of the things that are not correct. So a couple of years ago, the Caring Society partnered with the Wabanaki Council on Disability to do this report. I couldn't figure out a way to get it in the slide, so here we go. This is for those who can view this. This is a report called Jordan's Principle and Children with Disabilities and Special Needs, a resource guide and analysis of Canada's implementation. So this is kind of a wordy way of saying this is a booklet that tells you about how Jordan's Principle might be able to support your family if you have a child with disability or special needs. And one of the things we found in doing this report is that people have been writing and talking about Jordan's Principle for quite a while now, but because Canada has not been doing it properly, there is some misinformation out there about what Jordan's Principle is and who it can help. So number one, people might think that Jordan's Principle only applies to health. This is not true. Jordan's Principle is based on the needs of the child. And so that includes health, of course, but also things like social needs, educational needs, recreational needs, access to culture and language supports, products such as maybe iPads or hearing assisted devices, all of these sorts of things. The question that you don't want to ask is, what does Jordan's Principle cover? Because, we're not concerned about that. What we are concerned about is, what does the child need, right? That's the question you start with. What does that child need? And that's what you put forward as the request to Canada in terms of support. One thing we do need to flag is that Jordan's Principle applies to First Nations children. So Métis and Inuit children, their families have their own set of unique needs and areas of support. But because Jordan was a First Nations child, and because Jordan's Principle emerged out of that dispute between kids on reserve and off reserve and the Indian Act, that's why it is specific to First Nations children. A big one is about normative standard. So when I say normative standard, I mean, what does the province or territory normally provide, right? And so folks might think that when I think about my child needs, what my child needs, I'm limited to what the province or territory might normally give. No, again, we're asking, what does the child need? And Canada is responsible to make a decision about that need based on substantive equality. So not what does the province or territory ordinarily provide, what does the child need? And let's meet that need, recognizing that because of colonialism, past and present, First Nations children may have particular needs that need to be met. And meeting those needs is part of reconciliation and a commitment to doing better. We sometimes hear about Jordan's Principle being a policy or a program. It is not. As a result of the tribunal's orders, it is a legal rule that Canada is legally obligated to fulfill. And with that, Jordan's Principle has no end date. So, we don't think about this is a program sunsetting in 2023, whatever. No, Jordan's principle is a legal responsibility on Canada until, maybe until the situation in this country is such that we don't need to have this particular support for kids. So next slide, please. When you are thinking about the needs of your child, the child in your circle, you should know that, we talked about this sort of thing, the misinformation that is out there about Jordan's principle. What are the things that the tribunal has said that are factual? What are the actual things we need to know about Jordan's principle? We need to know that Jordan's principle needs to be based on substantive equality, number one. Again, meaning that it doesn't matter what the provinces or territories provide, it means meeting the needs of the child. The decision by Canada needs to be in the best interest of the child. They need to be thinking about the needs, and they also need to account for distinct community circumstances. So this might mean that if I live in a remote community and there are no services for my child in that community, there might need to be funds for transportation to make sure that my child can get to where they need to go, right? Or things might cost more in the north, or, all these sorts of things that if you live outside of, the everyday urban center, sometimes are forgotten by decision makers. All of those things Canada is legally obligated to think about in determining these requests. So next slide, please. I will send the organizers these slides, so you will have them. So I'm not going to go through this entire list of things that Jordan's principle might be able to support with, or should be able to support with, I should say. And, I just said, don't worry about what Jordan's principle covers or not covers, and then I give you this list. But my idea here is to give you examples of things that other kids have said they needed, right? And so to just get you thinking about, what are the things that my child needs? If they're not on this list, it does not mean that your child is not entitled to them. It simply means that they're not on this list of examples. But, some of the things that other families have identified have ranged from anything from, adaptive furniture to educational assistance to training for families, right? So there's a whole range of things in there. Next slide. So how do we access these services? There are a few different ways, but in the interest of being as most straightforward as possible, there is a 24-hour line that you can call 365 days a year and say, I want to make a request for my child. And they will either take your request over the phone right there, or direct you to someone in your region who can assist. If you call that number and someone tries to refer you on, you do have the right to say, no, I don't want to be referred on. I want to make my request now through you. And the tribunal has also issued very specific things that Canada needs to do to honor Jordan's principle. And some of these are around the times that they need to get back to. So I'm going to be honest and tell you that Canada is not doing the best job in terms of getting back to people, making decisions within the timelines outlined here. But in saying that, these should be your expectations in terms of, how the process should go. And, you have a right, if you don't get back with a decision, hearing a decision within a certain time frame, you have the right to call back and say, hey, I'm aware that the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal said you need to make a decision about my child's request within 48 hours. And it's been 3 days. I want to hear back, right? I want to flag here about who is eligible, because this is another piece of the misinformation that I think might still be floating around. In the past, you might have heard, it's only for kids on reserve, or it's only for status Indian children. The tribunal issued a ruling setting out 4 categories of eligibility. So number 1 is if the child has status. Okay. Number 2, the child does not have status, but they have at least one parent or guardian who does. Okay, so maybe your child is non-status, but you are status. So your child is there eligible. Another one would be maybe your child is not status, but you live on reserve. So any child who lives on reserve is eligible. And the third category is, or pardon me, the fourth category is children who don't have status, or maybe their parent also doesn't have status, but they are recognized by their nation. So if someone from your band, is able to write a letter saying, hey, Jennifer's daughter is non-status, but we recognize her as a member of our community for the purposes of Jordan's principle, then Canada is obligated to accept that as eligibility, because that is part of First Nations determining our own citizenship and who belongs, right? And that's our right. So I apologize that this may be a little bit blurry. So again, I'm going to send this to you, the actual links, so that you have all of the material for yourselves. It was just me trying to find the best way to jog my memory without overwhelming my slides with all the things. So let's go on to the next one. Now, I really quickly wanted to talk about Jordan's principle and the connection to requests driven by poverty. So very quickly, I'm going to say that there was a study released last September by the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, IFSD. They looked at data being held by Indigenous Services Canada to kind of see what's happening with Jordan's principle. Is it doing what it is supposed to be doing? Who is accessing Jordan's principle? From what provinces? What are they asking for? And why? The big question is, why are these kids coming forward and needing help? Because if we knew why, maybe we can get to those root causes, right? So that kids aren't having to apply for support. It could just get to them as a matter of course, right? So if you want to go ahead to the next slide. They found a few things, many things of note actually, but for the purposes of our conversation, they found that the number of requests in the areas of health, mental health, education, and requests associated with poverty were the highest. And really to them, it suggested that kids are coming here and they're making requests for things. And that's wonderful that they're getting those services and supports. Number one, though, why aren't they able to get them through other avenues? Right? So if we're thinking about poverty and underfunding on reserve, are kids having to go through Jordan's principle to get things that might otherwise be available to kids who are non-Indigenous living in cities? And number two, the poverty piece, right? So if we go ahead to the next slide. When IFSD tried to answer this question of why are kids making requests? Right? Why are families coming forward with this? The only thing that they could really point to in terms of why are people coming forward, and this part of this is because that the data Indigenous Services Canada has doesn't really allow them to answer this question properly, right? So it's a data issue, one, but of the data that they had access to, the only thing that they could really look at as the driver was poverty, right? As what was causing the need for people to come forward and make these requests. So with that, I will say that Jordan's principle does provide support in terms of basic necessities. This is one of the areas when we say, what does the child need? Basic necessities such as the family needs housing support, utilities, groceries, these kinds of things. This is part of that social aspect that Jordan's principle can assist with. So I'm going to flag that for everyone here that no, Jordan's principle is not this is an area that we're working through with Canada. No, it is not a long-term, income support, but it recognizes that poverty is, in many cases, a big need for families, and a big need, not a need, but a big issue for families. And particularly when we look at the intersection of disability and poverty, right? So I wanted to share this with you as something that is emerging as we look at Jordan's principle and how it's working to assist families. We don't know enough, but I thought it was fitting, considering the topic that we're gathered here today for. Next. Now, I know my time is pretty much up, so I did want to leave you with something that you might be interested in exploring more. And this is a free film available through the National Film Board by the very wonderful and inspirational Alanis Obomsawin, who is a celebrated First Nations filmmaker. This is a film about Jordan and his life. And she was able to find video of Jordan in the hospital with the nurses, photos, which when you think back to the time, 1999 to 2000 era, video and photos aren't as common as they are today, right? So we often get requests, do you have any pictures of Jordan? Do you have any of this? Do you have any of that? And we say, well, no, it was 1999. Like, people didn't have the sort of taking a picture of everything like we do now, but she was able to find some kind of home video type stuff that nurses had taken. And to me, it's just a really grounding reminder of what this is all for, right? To be reminded of Jordan and his story. And as I said, this film is free and available on the internet. So, I really invite all of you to check it out. And I believe that is the end of my presentation. I know that we aren't necessarily doing a Q&A, but if there are any quick questions that might have come up in the chat, I don't know if it would be appropriate for me to answer them if there's anything that might be timely or immediate. I'll look to the moderator to let me know what the questions are or if I should answer them.
I will put that right back to my amazing tech team, because I was deeply listening to you and not looking at the chat. So I'm not sure if there was anything that came up right away. The other thing we can do, Jennifer, is if there are people who have requested more information, we will certainly forward that on to you.
So how did I do for time? Terrible? Oh no,
you're great. You're great. You're all good. Today and for explaining this important legal requirement. We know there is so much to say about it, and we really appreciate the really in-depth way that you were able to sort of give us a broad overview in a very, very limited time. So thank you so much for your time here today.
My pleasure, and I will send along those materials. Is Monday okay?
Yes, absolutely. We for all of you who are interested, we will send it out in a follow-up email to reach out to participants and say thank you. You're great. You're great. Don't doubt yourself.
Everyone. Enjoy the next 2 days of this really amazing, and I'm sure amazing gathering, and I'm sure you're all going to learn a lot and from each other too. So be good and enjoy your day.
Thanks, Jennifer. We're so hard on ourselves, aren't we, as humans? My goodness, that was a wonderful presentation. Next, we have a short video from Alison Colon, who is heading the first territory-wide study in Nunavut that specifically looks at experiences of people with disabilities and their families as a research. She is a research associate. I'll breathe. She is a research associate with the Nunavumi Disabilities Makina Swatit Society. This video is a very brief overview of her ongoing research that looks at the ways in which increased costs of living are impacting families and individuals with disabilities in Nunavut. Kyra, are you able to share that?
Hello, my name is Allison Cologne. I am a researcher with Nunavumi Disabilities Makina-Swatit Society in Iqaluit, Nunavut, and we also use the acronym NDMS. NDMS is the only cross-territorial disability organization in Nunavut. Our mission is to achieve independence, self-determination, and full citizenship for all Nunavummiut living with disability. I'm so glad to join Disability Without Poverty today to talk a little bit about how increased costs of living are impacting families and individuals with disability in Nunavut. So we are currently halfway through a 3-year research project funded by Accessibility Standards Canada. As part of this research, to date, we have visited 20 of Nunavut's 25 communities and spoken with over 400 participants. While this work is still underway, we wanted to share today some initial impressions from our conversations with Nunavummiut, particularly in regards to the high cost of living in the North and the impacts and pressures that this places on families and individuals living with disability. Today, I'm going to talk specifically about 4 points that stand out from the research. The first is air travel. All of Nunavut's 25 communities are fly-in communities. Nunavummiut seeking medical care beyond the scope of their local healthcare center must travel by plane to cities like Iqaluit, Winnipeg, or Ottawa. While medical travel is covered by the territorial government, leaving one's home community to see a doctor, a specialist, or to have a procedure completed puts additional financial strain on families. Families describe to us needing to take extended time off work, locate childcare or elder care while they are away, and taking on unexpected expenses. Many participants in our research also told us that medical travel is a serious source of stress for them and their families. Weather and mechanical delays, as well as administrative barriers, can result in medical appointments being scheduled and rescheduled several times over before care can be accessed. The second issue is food security and food costs. Food costs in Nunavut are notoriously high. Store-bought foods can be up to 4 times as high as the equivalent food in other areas of Canada. And according to federal data, as many as half of Nunavummiut deal with food insecurity. Many communities cited an urgent need for food banks and food programs. In addition to high prices for store-bought food, country food, or traditional foods that are hunted or fished, such as caribou, beluga, or char, have been impacted by climate change, mining, and shipping activities. As a result, hunters and fishers may have to travel farther to find foods for their families and communities, leading to increased costs for fuel and additional time and effort. Certainly, many of the people we spoke with for this project told us about the challenges they faced to feed themselves and their families, particularly when living on limited income from income support. The third issue I'd like to highlight is housing. Nunavut is currently facing a housing crisis with limited units available and high cost to rent, heat, and maintain. Participants in our study talked about struggling to find appropriate and safe housing for their families, being on waiting lists for months or years, and dealing with very high costs. Many of the individuals we spoke with mobility issues were in housing without ramps or accessible features. Local housing offices are doing their best to connect community members with accessible housing, but units are limited and in high demand. It is imperative that new housing units are built with accessibility in mind and are financially accessible for families. And the last issue is transportation. Currently, Nunavut's 25 communities do not have public transportation, and many communities do not have taxi services or other service vehicles like ambulances or wheelchair-accessible school buses. For Nunavummiut without access to vehicles, ATVs, or skidoos, transportation is limited to walking where possible. Nearly all respondents in our study cited this as a major concern. Nunavummiut experiencing barriers to mobility have few options for getting around their community, and many participants have described to us being housebound for months of the year, if not year-round. Lack of wheelchair accessible transportation also makes medical travel very difficult. One family described having to travel all the way to Ottawa to seek medical care because there were no accessible transportation options in the territory to pick them up from the airport, take them to their hotel, and get them to their medical appointments. So these are just some initial impressions from the conversations that we've had to date. Clearly, increased supports and benefits would greatly impact Nunavummiut living with disabilities and their families, in addition to improved infrastructure. The final report for this project will be released in the spring of 2024, and we welcome anyone to follow us for updates on the project on social media at New Ability. Thank you very much.
Wanted to thank Allison for that video. We are very eager to hear the final report once the important research has been completed. And I wanted to especially thank Allison for taking the time to put this video together in the midst of literally getting back from her latest trip to Pang, Nunavut. So we deeply appreciate that. Our final segment in Learning from Northern and Indigenous Experiences belongs to Symbia Barnaby, who discusses various barriers for Indigenous people to access quick, adequate, and affordable care and services. Symbia is a health, equity, and community inclusion advocate. And beyond her training as a practical nurse, she is a single mother of 6 children, 5 of whom have neurodevelopmental disabilities. She is a storyteller, a filmmaker, and a wisdom translator. And thank you so much for being here, Symbia.
Thank you for the introduction so much. So as Amanda said, I'll just introduce myself really quickly. My English name is Symbia Barnaby. My traditional Haida name is Gu Ga Jung. My spirit name is Warrior Woman. I am of Mi'kmaq and Haida descent. The pronouns that I use are she and her. I am a single parent. Many of my children have the diagnosis of autism, ADD and ADHD, and anxiety disorders. I'm also trained as a practical nurse, a birth and postpartum doula. I do a lot of activism around Indigenous issues, like missing and murdered Indigenous women. I am a storyteller. We have a documentary that we filmed as a family around intergenerational trauma and how it's impacted our lives. And part of the film also discusses some of the experiences that we had within the disability sector within our community. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just share really briefly a little bit about our journey, and then we'll go into some of the barriers. So with my oldest child who was diagnosed with autism, the whole process had taken about 3 years from the beginning when we were saying, okay, we're noticing lots of things that are happening at the school's calling us, come and pick up your kiddo. You know, your kiddo's hidden in the school, your kid's crumpling paper. So some reactive behaviors were starting to happen. We had noticed many things long before we got to that place, but we didn't have any direction as to where to go or what kind of assistance that we needed to have. So I had approached my doctor and said, hey, you know, I have a little bit of a worry here. These are some of the things that are happening. And at the time I was doing nursing, my nursing school. So there was talks about neurodevelopmental disability. So it had come up as a subject. And I thought, wow, this is how my child is. There's many of these behaviors, many of the things that are presenting looks very similar how my child is. So we brought it forward, and from seeing the pediatrician to finally getting a diagnosis took 3 years. There was a constant turnover. So I live in northern BC. We're very close, like that's the last stop before you can go to Alaska. So where we are, there's a key, there was turnovers of key positions like the child and youth support needs, now that's what they call it, and other people that were meant to be able to help people come into the Ministry of Children and Family services into that queue, and through the healthcare system and through the education system. There was lack of cultural awareness. So a lot of different places that we went when we're asking for support didn't understand some of the key things throughout history that would cause some apprehension on an Indigenous family's part coming forward to access services. So in BC, the way that you access support services for a child who has autism is it has to go through the Ministry of Children and Family Services through the province, which a lot of people don't understand is a different branch than child protection. A lot of people lump them together and don't know that there's different support services that they are able to offer. So there was a lack of cultural awareness. We had repeatedly asked for respite. We didn't qualify for it. We needed a diagnosis prior to doing that. Instead, what the social workers that were connected to us at the time offered was a voluntary care agreement. So instead of saying, hey, we will find respite people to do respite with you, and we will try to help, figure funding or help you with programs, provincial programs or local programs, they said, sign your child over to us, or your children over to us, and we'll take care of it with a foster parent instead. So the oldest one was diagnosed at 10 years old. So there was a big gap of missed opportunities when it came to early intervention. One of the things that we were able to do as parents, so me and one of the other parents, we ended up opening up a Facebook page, our group, and invited other parents that we knew that were also dealing with similar situations. And we band together and we invited behavior interventionists from the Greater Vancouver area to come up. And she basically did a circuit with our children and some of the other children in the nearby villages. So where I live, there are 5 different First Nations villages that spill into our community that use our services. So we're considered urban to them, but to the rest of the province, we're considered a northern remote community. So the province, the province, the feds, or locally, nobody had taken initiative on how to get services to be able to be provided from our community. We as parents came together and figured this kind of solution out. It was short-lived. This person was able to come because her husband was riding a circuit doing radiology, so he would come up once a month. So she was able to come at the same time with him because he had his travel provided. So there's literally no local services for children with support needs. We struggled to keep a speech and language pathologist in our community and occupational therapist. And the ones that we did have were only included in the healthcare system and were for pediatrics. So it was 5 years old and under. So anything outside of that, it was on a parent to, one, know what they did, find and secure them, and be able to afford to pay for them and figure out remote services. Not like now where we have Zoom everything, but that was one of a big barrier. The closest place for us to have the assessment, because I live in Prince Rupert, so northern BC, the closest place is about a 9-hour drive from here in Prince George. Unless they made clinics, unless they gathered people together and did like what we did. This led to huge parent burnout and stress. We had other stressors going on. I had a very complicated last birth, 6 kids under 10 and 3 or 4 of them showing signs of having ASD. It was a lot going on and no direction, no help. And a huge apprehension on our part going forward, trying to ask for support services. And it actually, we ended up having family violence happen and complete breakdown of our family. And then we had child apprehension and family or ministry involvement with our family. Not because our children were injured in any way, but they were worried about my mental health after the assault that had happened. So huge. I was listening to what Jennifer was saying earlier, and she was talking about poverty. People don't understand, if we have to go and travel like a 9-hour trip, and we have 6 children, we have 5 children that still have to be taken care of, right? Or we have to bring all of them. So how much does that cost for us to leave here and go to a 9-hour drive to go and get an assessment done, right? We get calls from the school because our schools are understaffed and our children are undersupported because we can't keep people in those positions. What happens, right? I had a nursing job that I had, a full-time nursing job, and would get called all the time, come home, come home, come home. We can't find your kid. We've had the police actually have to go and find our child because they were an elopement risk and they couldn't find them. And so think of all the ways that we could make money, but we're not able to because we're getting called away, right? A lot of our time had to be spent being at the beck and call of the school and being able to be there for our children. Next slide. So I wanted to make sure that I spelled a lot of these out. I feel like some of them were touched on. So this is the province that I live in, is in BC. And you can see this, the map on the side here is of all the different First Nations communities. And you can look throughout that map, how many are northern remote communities or rural remote communities, right? Most of them. So when we're looking at barriers for Indigenous people, we look at proximity. How close is it to services, right? So if I'm talking about having to go 9 hours away to go and get an assessment, is that feasible to be able to go, or having to access those kind of services on a regular basis? No. And is it fair? No. Is it equitable? No. The next one is accessibility. We're looking at languages. Are some of the resources written in the languages of the people whose land that these services are provided on? Is it plain language, right? How many of us have gone into hospital and have found booklets, and the booklets is, medical jargon or language that is just over and above like plain language, right? That can create a big barrier. Not every Indigenous family is led by a mom and a dad. Sometimes our children are being cared for by grandparents, or aunties or uncles or foster parents or older siblings. It's not always a mom and a dad, and it's not always people who have an education further than a handful of years. My dad has stepped in many times and helped out. He has like an 8th grade education. Some of them have like 3rd grade education because they went off to work instead, or went to residential school and then went home and then didn't have connection to school afterwards, right? The next one is availability. So like I said, in our community, there aren't even these resources available in our community in the first place. That can be a big barrier. If you need a speech and language pathologist in your community and your community is 75 people and it's a ferry ride away, 4-hour ferry ride away, how easy is it? The availability is not in your community. You have to leave in order to be able to access it. First ability, anything that falls outside of what's covered by the province can be a huge gap. Look at massage therapy. My brain's too tired to think of all the extras that we might be looking at. Sometimes if your child doesn't have the right diagnosis, they don't have funding that's attached to them either, right? So a kid with ADD and ADHD that needs a behavior interventionist because they have reactive behaviors, how is a family able to afford to pay for a behavior interventionist if there isn't funding attached to a program for that diagnosis? If it's based simply on a diagnosis and what's attached to it, right? That family has to come out of pocket or they go without. The last two are really, really important ones to share is around colonization. So it was kind of briefly touched on with a person who opened when it comes about perception and values and belief systems. So the idea of disability, there isn't a word for disability in our language. And I do research on a bunch of different research projects. And this is what I found so far. It's a lot of the time, within our languages, what was used was a description of their gift. So if they were somebody who saw, that was the word that they used for that person. If somebody was a big feeler, that would be the description of that person. So it was more around gifting and not about disability. When we look at it, how is it that we have to convince people to use services if the belief system doesn't match, right? If we don't see the concept of disability and we see it through the lens of gifts, does that make sense without somebody completely breaking down why or what the value of that service is, right? So value systems being incongruent. The history of child welfare system and child apprehension. Currently, there are more children in the child welfare system. This has been said repeatedly. There's more Indigenous children in the child welfare system than there ever was at the height of residential schools. Indigenous children make up about 7%, so 0 to 14, they make up 7% of the Canadian population, and they make up over 50% of the kids that are in the child welfare system. Indian hospitals, and residential schools. So there's a big mistrust with Indigenous people and systems and the things that are provided through those systems because of history, which makes a huge barrier going forward to try and access those, because it leads to a lack of awareness on those systems parts. And then the last one there is to racism, right? So racism on an interpersonal, institutional, and a systemic level. So there is a big difference. I'll leave this one of the last thoughts I'll say is that there's a big difference between intention and impact. Some of these systems may not have any intention to treat our people with racism, but lack of cultural awareness, a lack of cultural humility, a lack of cultural competency translates to Indigenous people receiving that any of their behavior as racism. We endure it as racism. So that's those are the barriers that I would say that our family and most other Indigenous people are enduring when we are trying to access disability services for our family. Next slide. I think there might be one more. Oh no, I think that's 3. Sorry. I know I talked really fast. I was trying to keep within the time limit that, and because, yeah. We do, like I said, we do have the documentary. I'll say this really quickly. If you want to look up, setting up a viewing of it, you can look me up on social media. It's just Cynthia Barnaby with Instagram and Facebook. We have a website called healingnationfilm.ca. But like I said, you can get connected with me. And if you had any questions, you can always follow up with me after. And thank you very much, Hawa Will-Allen, for having me here.
Symbia, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your lived experience. Each of you speakers could, I wish we had a day just for you. There's so much there. And in particular, what really resonated for me was that parental barrier to work and imagine what we could do and imagine what we could do for this country if we had the time and the ability to go to work while we knew that our children were being cared for safely and properly. So thank you, and we will make sure that people have access to your links and to be able to reach out to you. I am now going to pass the space over to Amanda Fenton for some brief mentee reflections, and then we're going to take a very quick break, and we will be back at around 10:40 to move on to our second panel. Thanks very much. Here's Amanda.
Great, thanks. This is Amanda Fenton speaking, everyone. Mentee round 2, this should work this time. We just had some link gremlins in the Zoom chat. And I think what I just want to say is, having heard from our morning speakers already, Jennifer and Allison from NDMS, and of course, Symbia, is also like, this is our chance to gift them back in reciprocity. What insights did we hear? What do we want to carry forward? What maybe are we holding close to our heart? You can use the Mentee or the Zoom chat to be able to offer back some of those reflections so that then we can also pass along to them. So the Menti link is in the Zoom chat. Fingers crossed it works this time. As always, you are also welcome to use the Zoom chat, but we're also going to take a break. The Menti won't close, so if you don't have quite a moment now, do take a break. We'll be back at 40 minutes after the hour for our next panel, but enjoy a little pause. We'll see you back at 40 minutes after the hour, and feel free to use Menti or the Zoom chat. What insights do we want to carry forward? Gifts of reciprocity back. Oh, also during the break, there might be some tidbits, some lovely offerings being shared on the screen sharing. So take a break, but also if you're close, there's some viewing available as well on your screens.
Ma voisine de ruelle est une bonne vivante, allumée et amoureuse de fado. Toutes nos discussions ont lieu par-dessus la clôture, elle dans la ruelle, moi dans ma cour arrière. Elle ne traverse jamais cette limite. Ce matin, c'est vendredi saint et elle me demande des nouvelles des enfants. Jeanne fait les sourires qui feraient pâlir dans vie n'importe quel top modèle. Non, je ne prononcerai pas le mot dégénératif aujourd'hui. Lou est en train d'apprendre l'alphabet et il est terriblement rapide, c'est à croire qu'il oublie d'être déficient. Marianne rit. Quand même, hein? Je sais pas comment vous faites. Vous avez une force hors du commun. Moi, je pourrais pas. Chère Marianne, dire qu'on a quelque chose de spécial, c'est comme sous-entendre que nous, on est fait pour ça. Ça rassure les gens de se dire ça parce que ça leur permet de croire qu'à eux, ça ne pourrait pas arriver, je crois. Mettons une chose au clair. Il n'y a pas deux types de parents, c'est-à-dire ceux qui sont prêts à vivre avec un enfant handicapé et ceux qui ne pourraient pas. Personne n'est préparé. Et ça arrive à n'importe qui, aléatoirement. Ce qu'il faut dire aussi, c'est que ces enfants-là, vois-tu, on ne les aime pas moins parce qu'ils sont handicapés. On les aime comme le parent moyen aime les siens, c'est-à-dire à se faire passer dessus par un train. Donc, on ne les abandonne pas, la plupart du temps. On accuse le choc, on tâche de ne pas couler, on s'adapte. C'est comme si tu te fais amputer une jambe, tu réapprends à marcher, parce qu'il te reste quand même une autre jambe, et un minimum de volonté de vivre. Ce n'est facile pour personne. Bien sûr, au quotidien, je gère. Je vais à tous les rendez-vous médicaux, j'amène les enfants en théâtre de marionnettes, je les inonde d'amour, je me lève la nuit au moindre bruit, je leur achète des légumes bio, je leur donne leurs médicaments à l'heure, je les console quand ils pleurent. Je me débrouille. Sauf que je perds patience, je crie, je suis inconstante, je me saoule, j'oublie la soupe que j'ai mise à chauffer sur la cuisinière jusqu'à ce que le chaudron se vide et se soude au rond de poêle. Je ne fais pas les exercices recommandés par la physiothérapeute ou l'orthophoniste, je suis toujours trop fatiguée, je n'amène quasiment jamais les enfants au parc. Je suis super ordinaire. Bref, on n'est pas des super-héros. Arrête.
I miss my cheek caressing her cheek, the surreal softness of her skin. I miss the way her smile gradually, slowly appeared on her face. I miss her super high-pitched sounds of joy. I miss my silly talking to her. I used to go, and she would answer me with her own language, and for a moment we would live in the same world, which was a magic and mind-blowingly beautiful place. I miss the weight of her hypotonic, limp body on my chest. I miss her lips nibbling my neck. I miss her light. I miss breastfeeding her when she was a baby and believing she was healthy. I miss this blissful blindness. I miss saying I have a daughter without having to add that she would be 8 and that she's forever 5, almost 6. Connecting with her felt like touching grace and diving into eternity, really.
Wow. Okay, I need a moment after that. Higher, I think we're ready to move back into our next panel. If we could unstop the share. Thank you. Okay, here we go. Welcome back to those who were able to make this morning's panel, and welcome to those who are just joining us for the first time today. You'll find a link to the speakers and the schedule in the Zoom chat. We have simultaneous translation, so you must select your preferred language, English or French, by selecting the interpretation option on the Zoom menu. And if you need any assistance for accessibility, please drop a note into the chat. Someone can assist you. Our second panel today is a discussion about care supports. So this is another huge topic with many, many moving parts, and I'm sure, again, could be a conference all on its own. But for example, there's a need for flexible, accessible, inclusive care supports from birth to 19 years of age for many of our kids. $10 a day daycare, for which many of our kids don't have access, especially those with medical complexity. Before and after school care, nursing support worker funding, and respite. These are all interwoven considerations. There's currently a bill, Bill C-35, an act respecting early learning and childcare in Canada, which just completed consideration in committee in the House of Commons. Many of us feel that that bill doesn't go quite far enough in terms of defining inclusion and inclusive learning when it comes to children with disabilities who may have substantial barriers to inclusion. So let me introduce our panelists who can certainly grapple with these issues and more. Their bios, again, can be found in the link in the chat. David McDonald joined the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, CCPA, as its senior Ottawa economist in 2021. Since 2008, he has coordinated the Alternative Federal Budget, which takes a fresh look at the federal budget from a progressive perspective. Dr. Erica Cedillo is the Director of Public Policy and Programs at Inclusion BC, a position she has held since 2020. And Ayel Cohen is a professor of pediatrics and health policy, management, and evaluation at the University of Toronto. He co-founded the complex care program at Sick Kids and serves in a number of advisory roles. Our moderator today, who I don't know if I'm just missing on my screen, is Brenda Lenahan. There she is. She is not only my co-convener, she is a mom to a young son with health complexities. He inspired her involvement in advocacy and research. She co-founded the grassroots group BC Complex Kids and was appointed to the National Advisory Council on Early Learning and Childcare and the Minister's Advisory Council for Children and Youth and Support Needs in BC. We'd like to just remind you to use the chat box to share your thoughts and what's bubbling up. It will just go to the host, but we will be collecting those thoughts and any questions. And I will now hand it over to you, Brenda.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm really excited to be here with everybody today. This is a topic that's very close to my heart, and I see care supports. We intentionally called it care supports instead of just childcare because for me it extends with the families that I see, and for my family, this means everything from childcare in the early years, extending up through childcare for before and after school care all the way to the age of 19. And it also includes nursing support. Some children need a nurse with them full time. Some children need a nurse to watch them sleep at night so their parents can sleep. Our families also need respite. That's a break for parents from caregiving. And we, of course, need childcare like everybody else in the early years so that we can work. And so I'm very excited to have this discussion and tie this together with this group today. We are going to start with David, and we are going to, everybody's going to have about 4 minutes to share their initial thoughts and perspectives. Thanks, David.
Great. Well, thanks so much for the invitation to speak to folks today. I have certainly been looking at childcare broadly for a long time, in particular at childcare fees, but also at childcare access, broadly speaking. And so I think that for most folks who've been following the childcare file recently, it's pretty clear that fees are dropping, and they're dropping pretty substantially across the country. The CCPA has been tracking fees in Canada since 2014 across 37 different cities. And so we make about 10,000 phone calls a year to track those fees in individual cities. And so we have seen a massive reduction in fees in the neighborhood of 50%. That was the goal at the end of 2022. That's not always the case in every city or in every province, but that's broadly what we're seeing. Sometimes they're a little short. Sometimes they've actually exceeded targets. And this is in line with the federal plan, the Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare Plan, which is projecting a 50% reduction in fees by the end of 2022, which has already happened, moving towards $10 a day fees by 2025. That program seems to be well on. Is reasonably difficult to get it up and running. Childcare advocates have been advocating for more affordable fees in Canada for decades, and this is the first time it's ever really happened across the country, although certainly some provinces have had much more affordable fees, notably Quebec, although it's not the only one, for several years. Now, the other part that's much harder, frankly, is a discussion about wait lists and accessibility. And so it is absolutely critical that fees come down to make childcare services more affordable. The trouble now is to get the full benefits of those more affordable fees, we have to have people have the ability to access them, to actually be able to find spaces, to not be in endless waiting lists, to not put their kids on a waiting list when they come back with a positive pregnancy test, which is sometimes the case in some provinces. And so that, I think, is where we're at now. The feed declines are well underway. Sometimes we think of the construction of spaces in a physical sense, a sense of capital, and that's certainly true. You do need to renovate spaces so that they meet standards for having children in them. But one of the more important pieces that's underappreciated is the need for competent staff to staff those spaces long-term once you build them. And so, that sometimes comes up with a debate around, having the correct training, and that's certainly true. There's a lot of people actually that have early learning and childcare training. The trouble is they don't stay in childcare jobs for very long once they realize the pay is low and they're sort of lousy jobs, often part-time, with poor hours and poor quality of life associated with them. So, there can be substantial economic benefits to a more affordable and accessible childcare system. We've got the affordability piece in place, but we need the accessibility piece in place. Those major benefits generally come from much higher labor force participation. This is particularly true for women, and certainly one of the things that was seen in Quebec when they introduced their much more affordable plan in the 1990s. But you don't get that unless there's actually spaces for people to put their children in, and therefore you get more people working, more people paying taxes, and higher economic growth as a result. And so, when it comes to having enough spaces, childcare deserts, which is what we've called them in a 2018 report, and actually another report that's being released on Tuesday, are widespread. So these are postal codes with more than 3 children per licensed space. And we're primarily looking here at children that aren't eligible yet for public school. So they're not in kindergarten yet or not of kindergarten age. These childcare deserts are widespread in almost all provinces outside of Quebec and Prince Edward Island. And they're much worse in rural areas and smaller towns than they are in big cities. And even in big cities, childcare deserts are much more prevalent in suburban areas than they are in downtown cores. And so that's very much a broad overview of sort of the big issues in childcare right now. And so I'll hold it at that, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, David. Yeah, I was just thinking as you're talking about wait lists, I know for some families, being waitlisted it might be the only wait list they're on. And for many of our families, I just wanted to share, we're on wait lists for everything, for every type of service, for early intervention, for respite, for childcare. Yeah, we're waitlisted always. We're always deprioritized as well in childcare. And I was thinking about the accessibility piece. I know access right now in the federal discussion is about people being able to access a spot, but for our kids, sometimes it's literally about getting in the door. We need accessible, universally designed spaces as well. So it's certainly interesting to hear the national discussion on childcare and then relate it to all the other barriers that land on our laps as families of kids with disabilities. I am now going to pass it over to Erica. Thank you, Erica.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone, and good afternoon in other parts of the country. Thank you for my role as Director of Public Policy and Programs. I mentioned quickly for those who are the first time who hear about Inclusion BC, we are a provincial federation of members who are working and advocating for the rights and opportunities of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. We are based in British Columbia, and we are part of a national federation who is Inclusion Canada, advocating for the same. We are part of a major movement, a global movement, because it goes up into inclusion international, all inclusive lives and opening more spaces. And this topic about care and childcare And which I totally agree, Brenda, childcare is just one element of care. And that is very important to not lose sight of for families who have a child with a disability or other support needs. And in planning for this, I wanted to share a bit, what is like, the guiding part is what is needed is a real inclusive childcare. And the reasoning to why is very important to not lose sight of that. Early childhood as a critical stage of development, identity forming for all children. And that is true as well for children with disabilities. And although the challenge is that they are denied of so many opportunities to make this a reality for them as well. When David was talking about access, and when we look into what is needed I would see it into three main points, which is access, participation, and support. The access is just getting through the door, which we finding the spaces where this is possible. But for a child with a disability, is that setting is prepared to welcome them. And then once you get through the door, is what your participation looks like, right? And it is not like this is the group of children, and that is the child who needs the supports, and it's someone else's job to do and make sure that they are included. Inclusion is how we all come together, and that participation becomes a meaningful participation with a child, and the family can develop those networks and connections of support. And the third part about support, that is the underpinning of all this into what is needed. Yes, some children will need more support than others, and that is what we want to see happening, that there's a way to make those available in any part of the province and the country where a child needs access. Some of the work that I've done, or that we kind of support each other with my colleagues across the province, I can highlight the work from New Brunswick, where they have worked very diligently in supporting the organization. What we well in British Columbia is how we build a capacity in all childcare centers, so that this is not only the responsibility of a few, but a shared responsibility, because this responsibility is shared across society. Like, we want all of our children to be able to grow up and meet their potential and expand it as much as they can, to be a good citizen and a contributing member of our society just by the fact that they are a person. And in talking about what Bill C-35, in all this, and the challenge is that inclusion still is an optional thing. So what we are looking and aspiring for is that we will have, as a country and in every province, a legal framework that will ensure that inclusion is as mandated as inclusion in education, right? That it's not an optional thing. Not that childcare can say like, your child needs a lot of support. I'm sorry, we cannot. Next person, right? Yeah, it's a very needed service and support for all parents, and children who come with additional needs are really discriminated against by the fact that they have additional needs. So the hope that I see in these in Bill C-35 is the possibility of having a framework that legislates inclusion, and that with that will come the resources that would make sure that this happens. And that involves the training of the staff, the right compensation, the facilities that are designed for that, a ratio that is feasible for a childcare center, and that this is available from 0 to 19. And this is a conversation that Brenda and also break the assumption that a child only needs childcare until they are 10 or 12 years of age. Some of our children in our country, they need the support further and longer, and we need to respond as that as a society. So, what the progress of Bill C-35 is not as hopeful. There is the two elements that made it into the community process, at the level of committee, is that the guiding principles are talking about including children with disabilities, and the annual reporting is about ensuring that accessibility and inclusiveness are also reported on. There are minimal gains, and the challenge that we see now is that inclusion somehow in the discourse, when we're talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion all across sectors and places, somehow disability has been dropped. So now we have to say this needs to be disability inclusive. And just think about how that is. Like, we need to be labeling again certain specific way of experiencing life to make sure that you participate. I think that's not what we want to see. So meaningful inclusion for all children with the right supports when their family needs them. I'll leave it there. I'm happy to continue in the later questions.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you for touching on the legislation there. Yes, we really also want to see the rights included in the purpose, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We really would love to see that embedded in there. We really need it to be there, and yet unfortunately here we are. We're having to actually fight for that right now, and we were excluded, all of us, from the recent committee witnesses that were called. None of our organizations were called to speak, which was really disheartening, but we won't give up on that. That's for sure. And thank you for bringing forward the discussion about inclusion and what that can look like. I did have an opportunity when my son was young to have inclusive childcare for him before he started school, and that I was lucky is how I look at it. It was very unusual for a kid like mine to have that opportunity, and it was only a few days a week for half days. So we definitely need to do better. Now I'm going to turn it over to AL. Thank you for being with us. And he's going to bring a little different perspective to this conversation, I think.
Thanks, Brenda. And good morning to those on the West. Good afternoon to those on the East. And thank you, David and Erica, for your insights. I'm going to try to complement those from the perspective of where I come from, primarily as a pediatrician, a clinician, and someone who studies the way our health system in particular is constructed. So I'm going to try to absorb the insights that you presented on public policy, inclusivity, human rights that are so critical to all of this, and also reflect on learnings, hopefully, from the larger group who have lived experiences in this space as well. So my work is involved with the care of children with medical complexity and supporting them and their families. So for those who aren't aware of that term, these are children who have both disabilities as well as intensive medical needs. Examples of things like this could be being on home ventilation, requiring a feeding pump, the need to deliver various forms of therapy or medication multiple times a day. Many of these children need round-the-clock, eyes-on care to keep themselves safe. And this caregiving role is largely taken up by a workforce of unpaid family caregivers. And this role is disproportionately taken up by women. A report came out this week on caregiver labor from Statistics Canada that estimated that replacing the contributions of unpaid caregiving by employed caregivers would be in the order of $50 billion per year, which represents 3 times what we spend on home care and long-term care in this country. So I'm going to focus before our panel, I think, really highlighted that. But the impact of what happens when care are isolated, marginalized, or unsupported is profound. My research team has studied this in a variety of ways, and the data are quite sobering. There are impacts on income. Families of these children get poorer over time compared to families with children who do not have complex care needs. There's impacts on caregiver mental health, isolation, sleep disturbance, post-traumatic stress, and many other issues. And there's impacts on caregiver physical health. not just from the direct aspect of caregiving, like musculoskeletal problems from lifting and transferring when there are inadequate accommodations, but even impacts from chronic stress, such as on cardiovascular health and even, sadly, premature mortality. And the other important piece of research I want to highlight as a pediatrician is that even if I take the narrowest view of my job as possible, that I look after kids and not their parents, we know definitively from many studies that successful outcomes for children rely on optimal outcomes for caregivers. And successful support for caregivers is inextricably linked to success for children. So what do I think is important consideration on how to best support caregivers? Just want to highlight a few high-level items. The first one is I think we need to focus much more on the child in family as the unit that we target. Our systems are so siloed in many ways that still is a struggle. We have pots of money and various services for children with disabilities. These are in many ways inadequate, but at least they exist. Less commonly, we have some services and resources to support families, but they're often divorced from the needs of the children as it relates to the family. There's a lot of rhetoric bandied about in healthcare organizations about family-centered care, that families are at the center of everything that we do. But when we actually assess what that means in reality, it's often reduced to a misguided operationalization that focuses solely on family autonomy. Essentially, what happens is unpaid caregivers are being asked to do more and more to replace paid caregiving support. So rather than sending in a nurse to support care for a particular piece of technology for one of my patients, or we teach families to do it without always taking into account the unpaid caregiving, the additional stressors and other impact that that entails. The second thing I want to highlight is the concept of a life course approach. We need to provide supports that incorporate the journey over many phases and transitions for caregivers. And I think this came out in some of the comments about childcare. I'll give an example. A number of years ago, I was asked to advise the federal government on a new benefit for critically ill children. The benefit was meant to be administered for a year after the critical illness or injury. And this was in many ways a good thing. But the issue is that oftentimes the greatest need isn't right after the quote unquote catastrophic event that this benefit is meant to support. If it is a newborn, for instance, families may already have access to parental benefits. Often it is in different phases of the life course that caregivers experience the biggest stresses and financial needs, such as transition from hospital to home, home to school, pediatric to adult care. And this has been shown empirically in research. It is often during these life stages that families experience the most financial strain and underemployment. The third thing I'd like to mention is the idea of home care and the lack of appropriate human resources in home care. This is a vexing issue in Canada that I would argue has not received anywhere near enough attention, perhaps because those who receive home care are, to quote a paper on this topic from a while back, neither seen nor heard. We hear about hospital emergency departments closing in the news, but rarely around parts of the country, many parts of our country that have no home care resources, and even less so as it applies to children. Each jurisdiction in Canada has disparate funding sources, policies, shortages of qualified providers, and other systemic issues. All of these are critically important, but I'd like to highlight the importance of family choice. We have seen really successful pilots of giving family caregivers discretionary funding to purchase more services from unregulated providers rather than fewer and often unavailable services from licensed healthcare providers. And families are best able to assess the fit for their child without relying necessarily on the formal healthcare system. And lastly, building upon this, I want to highlight the importance of relationship and partnership. We just completed an evaluation of a large complex care program in Ontario that measured the outcomes related to receiving care from a dedicated team that was focused on the holistic needs of children, medical complexity, and their families. We compared the outcomes from those who received the services and those who do not receive the services right away, using a framework for assessing outcomes that was developed together with families in the program. An interesting finding from this research was that we did not detect changes in some of the outcomes until 2 years after families were enrolled. And I think this speaks to the importance of trust, relationship building, and mutual respect in all this work. Care supports aren't a one and done activity. It takes partnership between families and teams. It takes time. It takes attention. It takes patience. But when it's done well, it can have profound impacts. Maybe I'll stop there and look forward to interesting discussion with my colleagues.
Thank you, Ayel. I feel like we should talk more. You're speaking so much to the demographic that I am from, and you've done so much work in this area. It's incredible. Yeah, I almost feel like we really have gone through. My first question was about why it's important, and I think we have talked about why it's important here, and maybe we can talk more about, move into the second question and talk more about what those, some of them have been touched on as well, but what those policy solutions, what we could do. Again, talking about flexible, inclusive, accessible support. And we've talked about, room for children, a welcoming, inclusive space in typical childcare centers. We've talked about the need to expand the care support through to the age of 19, and about kids who have specifically, high health needs as well. And maybe we can just talk about some of those solutions, things we're seeing in other jurisdictions, and what this could look like if we did this all better. And I'll invite whoever would like to talk into that to start.
Maybe I can kick things off on the childcare front. I think it's worth pointing out, I haven't looked in great detail about children with disabilities. Clearly, there's going to be additional challenges there when it comes to childcare. One of the things that's fairly universal outside of PEI in Quebec is that there's not nearly enough spaces for anyone. So it's not as if there's a shortage particularly for children with disabilities in comparison to other groups. There's not enough spaces for anyone. And so there will likely be a big construction of new spaces, and how that construction really matters because it will lock those spaces in. If you've got a big expansion of childcare spaces that are not accessible to children with disabilities, that's going to be the case for a long time. And it's going to happen over the next couple of years. Much of this isn't actually happening federally, although it's being funded federally. These decisions are being made provincially. And so what provinces decide and how the expansion happens provincially will very much dictate accessibility in the future, broadly speaking, but also more specific for children with disabilities. That's certainly true on the physical construction of spaces, but also on how likely it is that childcare centers can retain staff with specialties. And so insofar as you've got staff that have early learning and childcare credentials, and also some sort of overlap into help with children with disabilities, you're going to have to pay them more. And so insofar as you're able to do that or not able to do that due to provincial policy, will really sort of dictate in this expansionary phase whether children with disabilities are included in that expansion. And so there's a lot of debate around, do we just throw some money at a chain of childcare centers just to build a mini mall of childcare in big cities? That would absolutely reduce the number of deserts. But again, they'll choose where they think it's best and provide services to whom they think is best to maximize their own benefits, as opposed to a public planning process, which is certainly what I'm advocating for, that would include features like, where should we build these new spaces? What should these new spaces look like? What are some other considerations around accessibility beyond just geography, which is quite important, like children with disabilities, like parents who work shift work. That I think is going to be a real expanding discussion, and it's going to happen soon. And so I think it's certainly well worthwhile discussing it within the context of children with disabilities.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. It's critical timing that we do get our voices to the front of those conversations. There's infrastructure being built, and there's workforce strategies being built, and that is it is critical timing. And there's opportunities. Interestingly, I heard other parents of typical kids advocating for support, maybe for family choice. So the support going to the family. So right now, you might not be able to accommodate all kids because of capacity at childcare centers, but there are opportunities to directly support families immediately with direct funding. Erica, I feel like you're ready to speak.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, I was gonna raise my hand. Added. I think it's a multi-layered, because all these things need to be tackled, and so that's what makes it sometimes complex or hard to follow all the threads. But what we've been hearing, and one of the our campaign at Inclusion BC, it's called Kids Can't Wait, when we're talking about the early intervention supports, and that is the entry point and has been kind of expanding. But what we heard from community consistently is that family-centered approach, child-centered, like the child of the needs of the child at the center, and how to bring in and really the flow of the siloing of systems, because that is one of the greatest barriers. So I think in terms of the advocacy work to move this dial is to also bring the awareness that it's not the work only of one ministry in any province. And it's true, like some federal funding is coming through, but the actions are going to happen provincially. And in BC, we see that, and I know that this experience across the province as well, that each ministry looks out for their own budget line. So we need to bring all those budget lines together, right? In making the design, if we're designing new places, nothing prevents us from doing a universal design right at the get-go. Show that children, all the needs of children, are considering an opening and a space. And I really want to emphasize that one of the big pulls that we need to do is to have a legislated inclusion, because right now, like, the optional part is not appealing to the kindness of the heart to make sure that your rights are respected or implemented. It's not a right way to go. Right, like we have an amendment, and that legislation will bring budget lines along to say, like, okay, if we have to include everyone, what is needed, and then how that is budgeted for. And I also want to I think what the diversity of implementations across the nation brings us to look at what are the current mechanisms for inclusion, right? In British Columbia, we have something that is called the Aboriginal Supported Child Development Program, or Supported Child Development Program, to support the access for additional support. It's uplifted in terms of funding to the level of giving more access to children, and it's been given in different levels across the province. So we have this proportion. Some regions are more impacted in terms of how less they are receiving to uplift this program. So while that might not be the ideal, it's what are the current structures like that we can look for uplifting and having more resources attached to it, while there are other ways that are being early childhood educators, how post-secondaries are responding to the training needs. If we consider that disability is a natural part of life, and all childcare centers can have the possibility of having a child with a disability at their center, that is not for an optional program. That needs to be embedded in the core curricula of the training of an early childhood educator. And with that, the wage grid, that is some of the work that is happening in BC, and looking at the wage grid and doing that next step. So it helps, because all these lines are going to be able to uphold a system that will be welcoming for all the children.
Thank you, Erica. Yeah, it just made me think as well, through the work I'm doing federally. I'm also hearing, so the ratios in childcare centers, essentially a lot of the stress and the inability to retain childcare educators that low wage and those ratios in childcare centers that do not allow for the consideration that every childcare center will have children with disabilities or developmental delays, some kind of support needs. Those ratios do not match the need. And that is part of the problem. And we can't let that problem lie with the children. That problem lies with the system. And anyway, great conversation. Thank you. And I wanted to invite AL in, just thinking about, again, about other jurisdictions, what we're seeing. There's been some interesting conversations lately about family caregiver pay in the US, that whole movement gaining momentum. We've been talking about the need for a caregiver benefit federally here. I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I want to build upon something Erica said. So, what, you know, it's quite clear what needs to be done, and sometimes it's useful to think why it isn't being done. And some of it is a human rights issue of a lack of inclusion of individuals with disability in policy planning. Some of it is actually, I think, structurally related to the complexity of governance. And almost universal to many of the issues we've been discussing is this idea of cross-sectorial relevance, right? If you are talking about, for instance, the topic I spoke about, like caregiver support, is that health? Is that social services? Is that finance? And it often crosses multiple jurisdictions, and that's not the comfort zone, I think, of policymakers, where it's much easier to compartmentalize something. So the topic I spoke about, which is on, you know, the concept of how we support caregivers writ large, that's a really good example of one. Like, health is in a really crowded place now of things that people are pushing to try to fund that we haven't funded traditionally: dental care, you know, drugs, lots and lots of things that aren't in the Canada Health Act. But to move from that to caregiver support, like it's just not the path of least resistance in policymaking, even if you take aside all the human rights issues and the burning platform that I think exists. There, for a long time, has been a cry for a national caregiving policy to frame a caregiver benefit and other policies that would then flow from that. The Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence has been pushing that for quite some time, and it's been a challenge. It's interesting, just last month, south of the border, which most of us would not look for as progressive social policy lab, actually the Biden-Harris administration issued an executive act that would have, you know, national support for short-term respite for individuals with dementia. So there are like examples from other jurisdictions where this happens, but part of it is finding kind of that window of opportunity. And the one piece I just want to speak about from my experience and interest in this population of children with complex care needs is the importance sometimes of partnering with other advocacy groups that aren't necessarily in the exact same space that I'm in, but nevertheless have a lot of shared commonalities. So the burning platform in caregiver support isn't at the moment caregivers of children with complex care needs. It's caregiving of the huge population of aging Canadians who rely on unpaid caregiving for so much of their needs. And that system, as everyone can appreciate, and as anyone who has seen what's happened in the last 3 years during the pandemic, has been hugely stressed and very underfunded. So sometimes finding that commonality with another burning platform where, it's not exactly the same thing. We're not talking about childcare. We're not talking about school-based supports. We're not talking about exactly the same ideas, but still I think that umbrella is often a helpful one to join in, or to develop a unified voice about ways of moving policy forward.
Absolutely. Thank you, AL. And actually, yeah, that particular group, if you're speaking of the Caregiver Center for Excellence, they are welcoming our demographic into their discussions, which is great. Erica, it looked like you had something to say, and then I think we need to wrap things up.
Oh, all right. Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Ayal was saying in terms of that those lines of partnerships are so critical. And for example, the Caregiving Center is speaking about siblings, right? We've seen it in how, like, because a child exists with a family, oftentimes has siblings, right? And not all of them, but in how we're building those networks and recognizing that care is supported. So I agree in that part. And at the same time, when you said the why this is happening, Ayal, it brought me back. One of the things is that we've consistently inherited an institutionalization mindset, right? When we say like, oh, your child has a disability, there is the specialized place, the specialized people, the specialized all of this that will take care. And what is shocking is when you talk to a person who has no direct connection, who with this unique needs, and you tell them that their parents don't receive all these supports, they are shocked. There's like, wait a minute, aren't we in Canada? It's like, yes, exactly. So I think they're raising the awareness. I think needs to raise them kind of that links that will kick people and say like, how is this happening in my country? Right. And there's a lack of awareness and the assumption that is happening on one side, and on the other, that it's this continued idea of institutionalization that looms over, right? We're going to be taken care of in this facility. Eventually, they will go X, Y, and Z. So we don't envision rich lives in communities and with the supports and the network around them. And I think that is a part that we need to continue emphasizing in the spaces that we go, to call it as it is, to bring awareness. What is the lens that we usually see people with disabilities through? And then breaking that stigma, which would be the ableist perspective, to really engage in designing those inclusive spaces and respond to that and continue with those. I totally agree that partnering with other advocacy, it's incredible that being one, the number of people with disabilities, and when we talk about children, that it's so overlooked. But I think there's a huge assumption that it's being taken care of, and that's not what's happening.
Thank you, Erica. It is so true. It is the general belief. Thank you all so much. We could talk for hours. I think we all need to get into a room together another time and continue this discussion. But thank you so much for being here. And I am going to pass it back to Amanda F. Thanks all.
Thank you. This is Amanda F. speaking as our panelists are released from the screen. We have a couple of minutes here before we go to a break, but again, we want to bring all of your contributions, your thoughts, what's you're hearing into this conversation as well. So I'm putting a Menti link into the Zoom chat. This is a new link from earlier. And this time the invitation is, what do you want to add to this discussion about care supports? What's important to you? Maybe was there something that you didn't hear or didn't catch that is missing, and you want to make sure that that gets introduced as well. So what do you want to add to this discussion about care supports? What's important to you? What is missing? Panelists, you're also welcome to add in. There's often things you think, oh no, I forgot to say this. So please also use that Menti link. And also the Zoom chat also available for anyone if Menti is not working for you. We'll just give a moment. I'm just going to make sure that I see a few responses adding in. And maybe I'm just going to play like a minute or so of some quiet music. We just want to give you a chance to pause from this incredible fire hose of information just give a moment to respond in that Menti poll or in the Zoom chat. What do you want to add to this discussion about care supports? What's important to you? Maybe is there anything missing? If you are still typing, please continue to do so, or still thinking or adding in the Zoom chat. I'm just going to bring up some of the responses that have been adding in. I don't want you to feel that your contributions are going into the abyss. They are all being aggregated here. How do we get a working group together out of this? Oh, perfect. I know Amanda Lockett is going to be talking about that a little bit later. Accessibility and inclusion is about so much more than physical access. There's more arriving in here. And also to lift up a few in the chat, just offering in about how gender role justice in the home and in childcare centers is, has been maybe overlooked or didn't come through so much in the discussion. How can we really be pushing for sex equality in these spaces? So please continue to add your voice in, your thoughts, your contributions. They are all so valuable to help chart a course for what might come next, the conversations rippling out. With that, I'm going to invite Amanda Lockett into the Zoom spotlight to transition us into a break with some movement.
Thanks, Amanda. We do have another body break. This one is a little different. We are going to share a video of the Disability Without Poverty co-chair, Luca Patuelli, aka Lazy Legs, who will get us moving. And so feel free to move in any way that you'd like. Luca would be here in person today, but his Ill Abilities crew are performing tomorrow in their No Limits, No Excuses show at the Providence Performing Arts Center. And just so you know, next month, Luca is the head judge for the next Breaking for Gold International Olympic qualifiers in Montreal. His video is divided into a few parts. The first one, he'll get us moving, and then he shows us a little bit about his Ill Abilities dance group.
Hello, bonjour tout le monde. Je m'appelle Luca Lazy Legs.
Hello everyone, je m'appelle Luca Lazy Legs.
Entertainer, dance educator, the founder of the Ill Abilities International Dance Group, and I am a co-chair for the Disability Without Poverty movement. I want to thank you all for participating in today's conference. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde qui a participé dans la
Thank you for participating in this conference today. We're going to have a break with some moves and some music.
Some music and movement just to get everyone just to change that energy going. So at this moment, I'd like to invite everyone to take some space around your rooms. You can stay seated, you can stand, whatever feels comfortable. However, just make sure that within your vicinity that you're not stepping on any objects, or that if you are going to be moving your arms around, that you're not going to knock anything over. En ce moment, j'aimerais inviter à tout le monde de faire attention.
I would like to invite everyone to be careful at the space you create around you to make sure there's nothing in your way, because safety, health and safety is our #1 priority. And so we want to make sure that there's nothing around you that you can hit with your arms or step on with your feet. And so the most important thing is your safety. And so right now, I'd like to invite you to take 1 second to just move around you and to make sure that the area is safe.
To make sure that the space around you is safe and secure. Great. So now what we're going to do is a little bit of a warm-up. I'm going to put some music on and I'm going to ask you all to follow me. However, you also have the ability to just dance to the music and dance however you like. The most important thing about dance is that it comes from here, comes from your heart. If your heart is beating, you're creating a rhythm within your body, and it's the slightest movement that makes the greatest difference. Often we get intimidated when we watch dancers because we see their movement and their technique, and we think that dance is all about technique. However, it's really all about just moving freely. So if you like the music and you like the rhythm, just move to the rhythm and move to the beat. However you feel comfortable, if it makes you feel good, then that's all that matters. En ce moment, j'aimerais mettre un peu de musique. Je vais demander que vous allez répéter.
So right now, I'm going to put a little music and repeat the movements that I'm making. And if you don't want to repeat the movements I'm making, just dance to the music, not a problem, because dance is a self-expression. And if your heart is beating, you are able to create a rhythm. Are you ready? Okay. And so before putting on the music,
smell those flowers, exhale, and blow out those candles. On respire, on expire.
So breathe in and breathe out.
And exhale. So at this moment, we're just gonna move our shoulders and go up, down. Say maybe. And now we're gonna go one shoulder at a time. We go up, down, up, up. Je lève mes épaules une à la fois. I'm lifting my shoulders one at a time to the rhythm. We're going 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hey! Pas mal tout le monde. Great job. And now we're gonna go a little bit faster. We're just gonna kind of just circle our shoulders one at a time to the rhythm. Hey! Nice! Great job, people. Nice. Okay. And now that we've got this rhythm going, I want you to bob your head to the beat. Just bobbing your head to the rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hey. Okay. And now we're just gonna say yes with the head. Are we having a great time today at the conference? Yeah. We're gonna say yes with the head. And now we're gonna say no with the head. I'm like, yo, no with the head. We want this conference to end. No. Good. Now we're gonna do a full circle with the head. Yeah. Nice job, everyone. And turn the other way. Stop. Now we're gonna just bob our head to the beat, but we're gonna bring our shoulders into it. So bob that head. Hey, hey, yeah. Hey, good. Okay. Now we're gonna try to lift our arms up as high as we can. And bring our arms up as high as we can. Good. And we're gonna wiggle those fingers. And we're gonna bring one arm at a time and go up. We're gonna lift one arm up in the air and we'll lift the other one up. One arm at a time. And now we're gonna lift both our arms up in the air and we're gonna cross our arms in front of us like an X with our arms. On va faire un X avec les bras. On amène les bras dans l'air.
Put your arms in the air and make an X with your arms. C'est bon. On y va, tout le monde. Ça va? Et voilà, les bras. Maintenant, on va mettre les bras devant nous. Et on va faire ceci. On va croiser les bras. On va croiser les bras au...
Yeah! Great job, everyone. That was amazing. How's everyone feeling right now? Thumbs up? Good. Now I want everyone to take one big deep breath. On va faire un grand respire.
One other big breath.
Exhale. Just shake it off. Remember, dance is something that everyone has the ability to do. It's really the slightest movement that makes the greatest difference in a performance. La danse, c'est une activité que tout le monde est capable de faire, peu importe notre condition.
Everybody can make these dance moves, no matter who they are, because the smallest movements make the biggest difference. Right now, I would like to share a video of my solo performance where you can see how I adapted and transformed my life.
Solo videos, so you can see how I've transformed my life to pursue my passion as a professional dancer.
Je m'appelle Luca Lazy Legs Petwali. J'ai 37 ans et je suis une danseur professionnel. I have a strong upper body and a slim, weak lower body. Dans ma routine,
Le haut de mon corps est très fort, le bas de mon corps est faible.
Voulant pour me déplacer. Tout au long de cette vidéo, j'ai dansé dans plusieurs lieux intérieurs et extérieurs à Montréal. To express myself, I will be performing a variety of movements that are energetic, poetic, acrobatic, and unique with the assistance of my crutches, wheelchair, and the floor. Caché en nous, hidden within us, que nous en soyons conscients ou non, la danse est présente. La danse peut nous transformer et avoir...
Whether we are aware of this or not, dance can transform us and can have a positive impact in the world.
No matter the age, race, gender, language, or ability. It is the celebration of humanity at its finest. Through dance, we open ourselves up to the world and feel a sense of belonging. La danse nous offre des possibilités.
Dance offers unlimited possibility to express ourselves in many different ways. It allows us to work even with the simplest movements. The beauty of dance is not just about movements, but it's a process of creation when we learn to be authentic and vulnerable.
And it is in those moments that we discover and expand our true physical, emotional, and spiritual potential. When we dance, we free ourselves from the worries and stresses of the world because we are connected to the present moment. Nous relâchons les tensions que nous pourrions avoir et créer.
So we free up the tensions we can have and create our pathway to growth. Dance is not a question of perfection.
C'est une façon de bouger pour se
It's
sentir
a way of moving to feel free.
Cette vidéo intitulée
This video entitled Transformation is produced by the Quebec Group of Dance.
and it is directed by Kayla Jeanson, with camera work by Kayla and AJ Korkidakis. La musique est Heaven's Anthem par Skygaze. L'équipe de production est composée de Nadine Meloir.
The production team is made up of the following individuals. Thank you to everyone.
So that was one of my newest solo videos, just to show you all what dance means to me and how I move. You see, I think that dance is something that is a universal language that really has that ability to bring everyone together. And it's part of the reason why I created an international dance group called Ill Abilities. Ill Abilities is a play on words. You see, ill literally means sick, but in the hip hop world, it means amazing and incredible. So Ill Abilities is all about amazing and incredible abilities. And what Ill Abilities is it's an international dance group comprised of 8 dancers representing 7 different countries. Each dancer actually has a completely different disability, but each dancer is considered to be some of the world's best b-boys. And we come together when we have the opportunity to perform in events, festivals, dance competitions, and we share a simple message together. And this message is something that's helped us overcome a lot of challenging moments throughout our lives. This message is no excuses, no limits. En français, le message, c'est pas d'excuses.
And so in French, the message is no excuses and no limits. And so for us, it means that we believe in life, everything is possible. Sometimes if we're not able to do something, it's because we haven't tried it.
See, no excuses, no limits is about giving things a try, trying your best, and taking that time to learn to do things your own way. Just because something is different, it doesn't mean that it's wrong. Take that time to do that one thing your way. You're going to start learning to believe in yourself. Once you start learning to believe in yourself, you'll have that confidence to put yourself out there. And once you have that confidence to put yourself out there, the community around you will encourage you. And that's when you'll recognize that the possibilities are limitless. At this moment, I'd like to share a video with you all, with my dance crew, Ill Abilities, so you can see how these other dancers have transformed their life to pursue their passions.
Luca, I know you're not here with us today, but I mean, you're at a competition, getting ready for a competition. That sounded. But you really always find a way to get us moving and to remind us that dance is for every body. And you're just one of the most happy, positive people that I come across. You make me happy and positive when I get to see your work and get to interact with you. We have just a quick moment or two to check in with Kelly to see how they're doing graphically. So we would love to see what you've got going, Kelly.
Well, this is a intense and delicious bite of just like so much good stuff. And so with a great deal of humility and imperfection, I'll offer forward what I have. So, I mean, really today started out, I had to put on extra paper because there's just so much good stuff. It started out with just like a lot of, I think love is super badass. And so a lot of the pieces in our opening, resilience, strength, and courage, and these footsteps walking through life in many formats is true beauty. And that was just some of the wisdom of our opening. And then opening speakers and just these opening kind of messages around intersectionality in terms of our approach is so essential in terms of poverty and disability for children and families, but just for all folks. That poverty and disability go hand in hand with so many forms of walking differently in this world. Diverse voices and lived experience being featured and lifted up, justice as a primary driver for this work, and knowing that poverty will not wait. The other part here was just, and it came up elsewhere, but around caregiving and mothers. And in our opening, this also was shared in a few different ways, but the wealth, not to think of us as deficits, not to think of our children or our families from a place of deficit, but from a place of wealth. And I think that's really important. And it really, it's just something I'll really carry with me. So the wealth of the love that we give our child, and thankful for our mothers, but I think also caregivers in the way that's a really expansive definition. We then went on to hear a lot about the Jordan's Principle as a way to ensure First Nations children get the care they need when they need it, that it's centered on needs, and that it's a legal rule, and it's based in notions of substantive equality. And that the main driver in the end that she talked about is that poverty is a main driver for so many of the requests that are coming forward. And then we moved on into the Nunavumi Disability Makanasukit Society and Allison, and talking about this being centered around self-determination for all of their membership and the hardships that are experienced by their families and barriers just for having to travel away from home, both the costs and being away from work. Other things that their folks are experiencing around food costs, access, and impacts to their food systems by climate change, as well as accessibility in really broad ways, from housing needs to accessible transport. We then heard from Simbia Barnaby and Hawa to Simbia. So much of her story resonated and was like she could have been telling mine as well, who is a mother and a Northern BC health advocate. And she just talked about just how many barriers there were to diagnosis and support for her and her family, and that the solution was that they took it upon themselves. They networked with parents to get solutions for children with support needs in remote Northern communities, and that this is a really big driver towards parent burnout and creating more risk for families in remote Northern communities. Because remote service and assessment is really and has been really non-existent, and that service and access is about proximity. And there's just these great distances. Here's the airplane that people are like float playing and planing and flying for 9 hours, I think she said. So it's not an equitable system at all, and that so much of your ability to receive the money you need to travel, it's a bit of a cart and horse issue, because getting access, you have to pay out of pocket a lot of time to get your diagnosis, but you have to travel to get your diagnosis. And so, you know, a lot of people and families are likely falling through a tremendous amount of cracks in this system. And I can speak to that personally, living in a small community away from major city centers, of getting access. We have lots of beautiful humans of all shapes, sizes, colors, and abilities showing up on this chart in the beautiful way they do in our life. And then we had a really important discussion around care support and ensuring that they're flexible and inclusive. And so a few highlights from there is it includes not only early childcare, but nursing supports and just expansive needs. That access is around the need not only for spaces, but competent staff, as there's a high turnover, so a need for training and compensation. Also the need for universally designed spaces and care beyond 12 years old up to 19 plus. That hard to find spaces and access is some of the bigger piece of the issue. And we outlined access, participation, and support from a shared responsibility lens. There was a bit of discussion about childcare deserts, and this piece really resonates around the well-being of unpaid family care and how much that matters. And so thinking about not just the support of the child, but just wraparound support is a bigger part of the conversation. That now, so these little seeds are growing as a part of this discussion up out of the earth, kind of being watered, because it's a critical time for expanding the discussion on inclusion and access. As we see more infrastructure, more things being built, it's really a critical time to get in now and ensure that those pieces are moving. And then, you know, this little growth, that I love this transformative symbol of this butterfly. What is hatching right now, centering these conversations in a space of a rights-based framework. And these little notes say embedding access and inclusion in the ECE and CYC training. And so there's a budget piece, and we're seeing what's taking flight in this discussion and what's developing. And then I love Luca. So there are movers and shakers here, and I'll tuck this into my heart. The way the smallest movements make the biggest difference, and if that isn't an important metaphor for us all as parents, feeling like maybe we're not making a huge difference and just trying to survive, and as people in bigger forums like this who have the privilege of getting some voice and some connection.
Thank you, Kelly. That's really incredible work. And we will certainly check in with you again at end of day, and we will have their charts available when completed. Thank you for that tour. And it's interesting. I mean, I know this is a conversation about childhood disability and poverty, but that poverty piece is certainly a very large one. Which brings us to our next panel, which is all about income supports. Before I do that, though, for those who are just joining us, I wanted to let you know that we are recording this. It's got simultaneous English and French translation, so you do need to pick an interpretation option of English or French. And for the full speaker bios and the schedule for today and for tomorrow, you can find that at the link in the Zoom chat on the Disability Without Poverty website. So our last panel for today, I told you at the beginning, this would go really fast. It feels like it's gone very, very quickly. But our last panel for today is a discussion about income supports. And these include items such as the federal child disability benefit, provincial supports, and lived family experiences of poverty and financial instability related to childhood disability. Tools at hand include the Child Poverty Report Card, the Market Basket Measure as it relates to disability and barriers to accessing things like the disability tax credit, what current federal initiatives provide opportunities or challenges for child disability initiatives. Our panelists today are Leila Sarangi, who is the National Director of Campaign 2000, a pan-Canadian movement working to end child and family poverty, and the Director of Social Action at Family Service Toronto. Just a reminder again that these fuller bios are available on the website. Our next panelist is Dr. Jennifer Zwicker, who is the Director of Health Policy at the School of Public Policy and an Associate Professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology at the University of Calgary. She's the Canada Research Chair in Disability Policy for Children and Youth and the Deputy Scientific Officer for Kids Brain Health Network. And rounding out our panel is Michael Prince. He is the inaugural Lansdowne Professor of Social Policy in the Faculty of Human and Social Development and an adjunct faculty member in the Department of Political Science in the Faculty of Social Science at UVic. Our moderator is again my co-convener, Brenda Lenahan, who is mom to a small son with health complexities. She runs BC Complex Kids and was appointed to the National Advisory on Early Learning and Childcare and the Ministry Advisory Council for Children and Youth with Support Needs in BC. Brenda, over to you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I think I'm just going to jump into it and get this discussion started. We're going to start with Layla. If you want to start sharing your perspective and experience on this topic. Thanks, Layla.
Thank you, Brenda, and to the organizers. This has been such an incredible and incredibly important discussion all around, and such a well-organized event. It's amazing. So thank you so much for inviting me to share my particular perspective. I'm also here to learn and grow about these issues. Campaign 2000, as was mentioned, is a pan-Canadian coalition of over 120 community organizations from across the country working together to end child and family poverty. We came about in response to a 1989 unanimous all-party federal resolution that passed in the House of Commons back in 1989 to end child poverty by the year 2000. So that is where we get our name from. It was a coalition of organizations that came together to try and hold federal feet to the fire around those commitments, because after 1998, rates of child poverty were increasing and were actually peaking by the year 2000 when they were supposed to have been eliminated. Family Service Toronto is a large multi-service organization that has been the backbone agency for Campaign 2000, providing all kinds of resources to ensure its longevity. And they do have a very large program for adults and children with developmental disabilities, so are really invested in the conversation today. We have been, since 1991, Campaign 2000 has been annually tracking, monitoring, reporting out on, acting as a bit of a watchdog on issues of child and family poverty. Our latest report card came out in February of this year. We not only look at the data that comes out of Statistics Canada, but we put forward community-driven, achievable policy solutions. Our latest report card found, and these are trends that we have been seeing year over year, continued significant high rates of poverty across the country. We're looking at data from 2020. There's a little bit of a lag in the tax filer data that comes out, but we prefer tax filer data because it's so broad. Anybody who's filed a personal income tax form gets counted in the low income measure that's derived from that data. So according to that data in 2020, still 1 million children lived in poverty across the country. The data, you don't get a lot of disaggregated data, you get some disaggregated data from that, but we also look to census data. There was a recent census release also from 2020 that continues to show significantly high, disproportionately high rates of child and family poverty for children from groups who are systemically marginalized. We heard earlier from Indigenous identified communities. So First Nation children living on reserve, living off reserve, Inuit children, Métis children have exponentially higher rates of child poverty because of ongoing experiences of colonization and systemic discrimination. New immigrants, racialized folks, children in lone parent-led families, particularly mother-led families, all have higher rates of poverty. What we don't have is good data on children with disabilities living in poverty. We don't get that from the tax filer data, and we don't get it out of the 2020 census data. We could probably buy it, but I think it's very expensive to buy this data. So we don't have it right now, but we know from experiences like everything we're hearing today, that there's such a deep connection there. And once we get the data, we know it's going to show disproportionately high rates. And we know the surveys that survey children 15 and older, or young adults with disabilities 15 and older, have disproportionately high rates of poverty. We have a policy platform that covers addressing systemic inequality, because as we've heard around intersectionality, it's so deeply embedded with experiences of poverty and manifestations of poverty. So our platform really addresses ending poverty by ending systemic inequality. We have recommendations around income security, around creating decent work, around public health, and well-funded public services like housing and childcare. We have put forward, and I think this is going to come back to discussions from earlier today, but we're really encouraging trauma-informed policymaking that relies on the principle that policies should do no harm. They should do no more harm to people in communities. And it should be developed with those who are most affected at the center of that policy development. I think sometimes our experiences get written off as, not technical, not real policy experiences, but communities. Everybody here, we've been here and have the solutions for government to be able to implement. And that's really, really important to have that at the center of the policy recommendations. And that, as the last speaker was saying, to drive towards realizing our human rights and advancing obligations under the Convention of the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Rights for Persons with Disabilities, advancing our human right, sustainable development goals, commitments, advancing the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. And in terms of income supports, our report card also found that in 2020, even though 13.5% of kids, almost 1 million kids, lived in poverty, that was actually a historic low. And that was because when the economy shut down due to COVID, large swaths of the economy had shut down, the federal government stepped in a really big way and really quickly with emergency new programs, emergency benefits like the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, and then one-time top-ups to existing programs like the Disability Tax Credit, like the Canada Child Benefit. And what we see in our report card, we have this line graph, and you kind of see poverty rates like tracking up here, pretty high, a little bit of a dip when the Canada Child Benefit was implemented. But in 2020, that line just dropped significantly, because what happened was those combined benefits, more than $102 billion, went to families and lifted those who were in our bottom incomes up. Now those benefits have ended. There's interactions in the way that they were designed. So those emergency benefits have interacted negatively with other existing benefits. Inflation has skyrocketed. So what we're seeing now, early data and modeling is we're seeing those poverty rates starting to increase. So I think my takeaway, or the takeaway from the what we learned in the last report card, we have the numbers that show that those kinds of income transfers, while we're waiting for things like available, inclusive, fully accessible, universal childcare to be built, let's start by getting money into families who need it, so they can at least start meeting some of the basic needs without stress. So that's one of the things the last report card taught us, and making sure that they're accessible and available to people, like easy to access, like the CERB was very easy to access. So those are some of the highlights that I wanted to share today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation afterwards. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Leila. I just wanted to point out before we move to Jennifer is that we've actually shared the Menti link. We were going to wait till the end, but we've just decided we would start sharing that now. So if people would like to use that link to share their input, we are collecting all of that. You can also share in the chat while you listen. Or I'm not sure if you can share in the chat right now, actually, but you can definitely share in the Menti link. So we encourage you to do so. And Jennifer, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And I echo Leila's comments that, this is such a fabulous meeting, and it's been such rich discussion already. So, try to just really add to and emphasize a lot of the great points that have been made already in the conversation. I'll just acknowledge that I'm calling in from the University of Calgary, which is Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and is City of Calgary's home to the Métis Region 3 in Alberta as well. So just really privileged to live, work, and play on the beautiful land here. I guess I'll start off because I think the context for this discussion is around income supports and sort of policy. I mean, I won't go into it too far, but I would say just re-emphasizing the points being made about the UN Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the fact that, Canada signed that, and provincial programs also need to be aligning with that. So, I think when we think about policy, sometimes this gets a bit disconnected from how like the principles and the need to reduce barriers to participation in society, and then how we actually design and deliver programs and supports federally and provincially. So I think it's always a good guide to go back to UN conventions and think about that from a principles perspective. And I would say that because if you look at, and Layla's already gone through some of the data, like if you think about some of the data that we do know about, by and large, our programs just are not doing that, not meeting the needs of persons with disabilities. We know that. We know that from the Canadian Survey of Disability, that about 70% of persons with disability have daily needs that go unmet. About 40% don't complete high school, about 30% complete high school and post-secondary, and about 65% are not in the labor force. So mean personal income from the Canadian Survey of Disability is about $16,000 a year. So, this is a reality from the population data. We've also heard a lot about the role of families and caregivers, and families provide over about 80% of support for activities of daily living. And people are reporting about 70%, again, of needs going unmet still. So, this is something that we have to kind of keep in context as a real important guide for thinking about better ways of designing programs and services to better meet needs and kind of meet those UN Convention commitments. So I think the piece I was going to talk about is around poverty measures, which is probably quite pertinent to build off of the points that Layla was making. So in Canada, we use the market basket measure. This is a measure that it's sort of a benchmark of poverty. There are a number of different poverty measures. And, I guess the thing that needs to be considered as you're thinking about designing programs and benefits, because this poverty measure often gets as a benchmark for how you design benefits. So it's important that we know what that level is and how it relates to persons with disabilities. And so we've done some work using the Canadian Survey of Disability to look at this measure. And I'll just say kind of the take-home message is that it's underestimating the basic needs of persons with disabilities. So first and foremost, we know that persons with disabilities disproportionately have higher rates of poverty than persons without disabilities. It's about 42% higher. So that's, it's substantially higher. And the market basket measure, what it looks at is food, clothing, transportation, shelter, and other goods. And so the thing that I think needs to be considered is that there are other basic needs that persons with disabilities who are living in poverty have that aren't captured by the main market basket measure. So, this is something that we need to consider, because just because we've perhaps raised income levels of persons with disability to the market basket measure, they quite likely are still experiencing the same impacts of poverty. So in particular, some of the areas that weren't covered were caregiving supports and housing accommodations and accessibility. And then other accessibility supports like assistive devices. So just from a program design perspective, it's important to keep that in mind at a measure level. The other piece I was asked to touch on briefly in kind of opening remarks was around the disability tax credit. And I always find I'm sure for this group, it's not a strange thing to talk about, but I think if you talk to international folks, it's very strange to talk about a tax credit. But it's such a cornerstone of the Canadian system right now. And we know that from data that about 30% is the uptake rate of people who we believe are eligible for the disability tax credit that are actually getting access to it. So, this is the story for
federal programs like the disability tax credit, but it applies to provincial programs generally as well. Uptake rates of people who are likely eligible are much lower than you would expect. And so this gets to major issues with thinking about some of the design principles around some of these programs. We've from discussions and research we've done, some of the key things are really awareness is certainly a big issue, but also difficulties accessing programs. So complicated application processes, eligibility criteria that is complicated for people to navigate, and also the fundamental design of it being in the tax system requires people to file their taxes. And the other aspect that the disability tax credit is a non-refundable credit means that people who are lower income often don't see the value of seeking out the long process that it takes to get access to it, which leads to another point around not having the disability tax credit in Canada would have prevented you from receiving the disability supplement from the COVID supplement that occurred. It would have prevented you from getting the child disability benefit. So, these are the kinds of things that from a design perspective, it becomes quite critical. So, and unfortunately, we also know that the inequities are particularly strong for across some disability types, particularly mental functions. In some provinces, particularly Quebec, uptake rates are much lower. For Black, Indigenous, and racialized groups, uptake rates are lower. For lower income population groups, uptake's lower, and for childhood disabilities. So those are kind of the core groups that, I think would deserve particular attention. So I'll just finish with saying that, I think the way forward needs to be an approach that considers sort of a functional needs approach, and thinking philosophically more about an approach of trying to meet people's needs rather than being kind of this gatekeeper that's making people kind of run the gauntlet to access programs, and using that as a way to sort out who gets access and not. So your ability to navigate a system shouldn't be the determinant of who is getting access. So I'll finish there for now.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, absolutely. There are so many barriers that both of you have spoken to, and it feels like our system is rather archaic and needs to be modernized. But of course, that's a slow-moving ship. We are going to now move to Dr. Michael Prince, and I'm going to give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brenda. And let me too echo my congratulations to the organizers and the participants today. Fabulous event and national discussion today and tomorrow. I too am calling in from Victoria, which is the traditional territory of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, today known as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. And with much gratitude, I live on these territories as a guest on their unceded traditional ancestral lands. I was asked to talk a little bit about some of the current or recent federal initiatives as they pertain to income support. And again, just building on Leila's and Jennifer's excellent comments as well, just to remind people that about 5 or 6 years ago, in life before COVID, in 2018, the federal government passed the Poverty Reduction Act. And with that, it adopted the market basket measure that Leila and Jennifer are talking about. So Canada now has an official poverty line, an official measure. We never had that. So going forward, conversations and debates can and should be guided by that very much, and has real implications for empowering family groups and other community groups and social planning organizations and advocates in framing demands, asks, human rights claims, very much informed now by the notion of we have an official poverty line at the federal level. And I'll come back to that in a minute with respect to the Canada Disability Benefit, which is going through Senate and Parliament right now. The next year in 2019, Parliament passed the Accessible Canada Act. And with that, again, it applies only to federal jurisdiction, but it adopted a more modern, inclusive notion of disability. So 2018, we adopt a poverty definition, fairly modern, fairly progressive, with limitations, as Jennifer pointed out, particularly for people with disabilities, but nonetheless an official measure. The next year, we adopt the Accessible Canada Act, which not only talks about intersectionality with respect to disability, it also talked about barriers. And as Jennifer's just said, and you, Brenda, just echoed it as well, it identified that policies can be barriers, and that much of the systemic marginalization Leah is talking about is really, it's in the programs, it's in the services, it's in the way we design and deliver programs that ostensibly are there to help people, but often they are barriers and hindrances, and can actually inflict harm and even traumatize people. So among the array of barriers that the Accessible Canada Act talks about, it does identify policies, programs, and service deliveries as places where we do know barriers currently exist, and in the principle of do no harm or future harm, that in any reforms going forward, be sure that we do not have any unintended consequences to exacerbate or create new barriers. A couple of years ago, the early learning and childcare agreements were signed and launched. Now, this focuses on provincial jurisdiction and day program, not day programs, childcare spaces and programming. About $30 billion of federal monies over the next 7 or 8 years. About $3 billion of it directed towards Indigenous organizations, communities, $27 billion to the provinces and territories. Now, as many people will know who are participating today, some of the principles informing those agreements are about accessible and affordable and adequate, but also inclusive. And there is language in the agreements about recognizing how to support families with children with what they call varying abilities. That's the language in those agreements, but it was a really key consideration by disability groups to make sure there was some recognition that there are barriers within our early learning and childcare systems, and we need to pay some particular attention to how to enhance inclusion and access and adequacy for families with children with an array of disabilities. Just quickly, a couple other 2 or 3 things that have been meaningful developments. One was the Pay Equity Act that was passed by the Government of Canada a few years ago. This is to address gender gap wage discrepancies. Again, it only applies to federally regulated businesses and sectors, but it's a significant acknowledgement of trying to help support families, working families with children with disabilities, I think. At the very end of last year, in December of 2022, the employment insurance sickness benefits were expanded from 15 weeks of maximum benefits to 26 weeks, which many groups, including myself, have been calling for many, many years. And the federal government also introduced 10 days of sick paid leave, effective as of the end of last year, beginning of this year. Now, again, those apply to federally regulated sectors and businesses. So while these are positive federal initiatives, they often only relate to about somewhere between 7 and 10% of the Canadian labor force. And it's also, and if you are in the labor force, you have to have the labor force attachment to be eligible. So those are positives, but they're steps forward. Looking, now I just want to talk briefly about the Canada Disability Benefit. Now, why would I mention it on a panel on childhood disability? It's a benefit targeting working age adults with disabilities. So it's presumed to apply to people ages 18 to 64. But I want to just, a couple things it's triggered. One is, well, what about the people who are under 18, and what about the people who are over 64? In the groups that have appeared before the House of Commons Committee and more recently the Senate Committee looking at this bill, there's been a lot of attention paid to seniors. And well, what's going to happen to someone who, when this benefit's introduced, they hit 60 or 65, assuming this is a substantial income supplement benefit that will help people who are currently on other programs, lift them out of poverty. this benefit ends at 65, do they just go on old age security and guaranteed income supplement? Are they going to fall in terms of their financial security that they've been experiencing for many years? So there's been a lot of attention on that. Ironically, the poverty rate among seniors is far lower than it is among younger people. And it's been kind of a lost message here by senators. I get it, senators are older people and they're thinking about their own peer group. The message that didn't come across loudly enough was, well, what's the impact of relation between a new Canada Child Disability Benefit and the Child Disability Benefit, or the Disability Tax Credit and other benefits targeted at families with children and youth under age 18? There's been hardly any discussion of that within the parliamentary arena. And now, Minister Qualtrough, Carla Qualtrough, is aware of these issues, but she's saying, well, I want to get this program in place first, then we'll get around to those other ones. What I find even more puzzling is that a Liberal Party promise to double the child disability benefit made several years ago has remained on the sidelines, forgotten. Now, I'm wondering whether they're waiting so once this new child benefit for working age is introduced, that they will then start to figure out how other programs interact with it and what to do in terms of the inequities that are inevitably going to be generated by a new income supplement for working age, but no new investments for families with children and youth with disabilities. So that's kind of a watch your space. If I've just got a minute left, Brenda, I'll just quickly, one thing that's been very interesting around the Canada Disability Benefit is the bill is what's called a framework piece of legislation. It's very skeletal. There's most of the details will have to be developed in regulations after the bill becomes law. That triggered a lot of concerns for groups that appeared before the House of Commons Committee last fall. And one of the things groups said was, well, there's really no definition of adequacy in this bill. This could be the regulations could establish a benefit worth $1 a month. Like, there's nothing in here that really, other than nice words in the preamble about addressing financial security and tackling poverty. So the House of Commons Committee did amend the bill in 2 or 3 ways. And one of the ways they did was they added some language saying, well, when the government is deciding on the program design issues that Jennifer talked about, all the details that you have to think through on what the benefit amount will be for the new Canada Disability Benefit, the government must take into consideration the official poverty line as stated and defined in Section 2 of the Poverty Reduction Act. So that's the first time now a parliamentary committee said, okay, you're right, we now have an official poverty line. Let's put that in the language of the law. Now, what's interesting is it's come to the Senate and groups said, that's not good enough. And as Jennifer said, we know that the poverty line, the official one, doesn't capture 20, 30, 40% of the actual costs of families and individuals living with disabilities. So a number of us said, you've got to expand and improve upon the language that the House of Commons did, going beyond. And here's the amendment that came, and this is just out from yesterday. The Senate tabled a report, which will now be debated next week on the floor of the Senate. So it's not a done deal. So you might want to contact senators and say, please pass these amendments. But they've taken this amendment and said, not only should the benefit take into consideration the official poverty line, it should also, and it adds 4 other things. One is the additional costs associated with living with a disability. Now, if this passes, this will be the first time in law, in the federal level, that's spoken to. The next one they add is the challenges faced by those living with a disability in earning an income from work. So again, that's a really important piece of this is that, and then next is they add, and to take into consideration the intersectional needs of disadvantaged individuals and groups. Now that language was in the preamble, but what they're trying to do here is embedded in the core of the law to say, well, when the cabinet is deciding on the benefit amounts or in the future how they should be raised or improved upon, they must, as a matter of course, not only look at the poverty line, but intersectionality. And the final one is that the government needs to take into account Canada's international human rights obligations that Layla talked about and Jennifer. So that's a wonderful package of about 5 criterion for a lens now to start talking about what do we mean by adequacy in this country. So fingers crossed, this amendment gets adopted by the Senate. The bill will then have to go back to the House of Commons, and the House of Commons will have to vote on and accept, hopefully, 5. There's 5 amendments the Senate is proposing. We'll see if they pass the Senate next week. They'll have to go back to the House. The concern by a lot of disability groups is time is running out close to the summer recess. Will this bill pass and get royal assent before the summer? We've been here before where we had a bill and there was a snap election and the bill died. So a lot of disability groups are struggling around past the bill. But on the other hand, these are profound amendments that really would signal a much more favorable and I think hopeful future. And if this passes, then when we talk about the child disability benefit and others, we'll have this new language in law that really, I think, changes the game. So although I'm frustrated by the slow pace of change on a lot of things, I try to find the silver lining in the clouds. And this could be a really significant new development in the way groups and families and researchers like Jen and I approach and talk about, and Layla and the advocacy, informing Campaign 2000. This really could be a very significant new development. And I'll stop there. Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that update. I have not been quite keeping up with it in the last few days, but that's
well, you've been busy.
that is really promising to hear that. And yeah, there's a wealth of knowledge here. You know, we've really talked about a lot of the barriers and a lot of the current state of what's going on with benefits. And I guess I wonder if now maybe we don't have too much time left, to be honest. We have a few minutes, but if maybe each of you could take a minute, pretty close to just a minute, and maybe talk about what you see in other jurisdictions that you would like to see happening here, or maybe not other jurisdictions, but just what do we need right now in terms of possibly targeted basic income, caregiver benefits, or working with the child disability benefit that already exists. I'll start with Layla. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And yeah, I also appreciate that update, Michael. I will just say hesitantly around the market basket measure is that it uses a very, very small survey that doesn't include people who are living in institutions, a lot of people with disabilities in congregate settings, in group homes, kids in foster care, anyone in institutions, in hospitals. It does not account for anybody living in the territory. So thinking about what we heard this morning. So as we're thinking about what else needs to go in that basket, those additional expenses for Northerners, you know, it doesn't include anybody on First Nation reserves. So the experiences of Indigenous people, First Peoples are completely erased. So while it's great that it's legislated, Campaign 2000 has actually been advocating for the use of tax filer data, which is broad, inclusive, and uses a relative measure, the low income measure that asks, not only can I afford my basic needs, but can I afford the same opportunities as my neighbors, as other people in our society? And to me, that's the crux of the human rights conversation. But I think, Michael, I totally agree that there is so much value and opportunity to have what does it mean to not be in poverty legislated in other frameworks throughout, and how you really start to advance that. Because I think the goal is the same. Just wanted to lay our some hesitation around the market basket measure and how it gets calculated. And then in our report card, maybe the link will go or has been put in the chat, but we have a graph that compares the poverty rate from the low income measure and the market basket measure. And there's a 50% discrepancy. So the threshold is lowered and the number of people that are considered to be living in poverty are about 50% lower when you use the market basket measure. So just a note of caution very quickly on what I think we need. We need a CERB amnesty. So anybody who's gotten those pandemic benefits, the federal government is doubling down and going after people to repay now, 3 years later. I've actually heard from a lot of people who have disabilities who have been, pursued by the government, asked to come in for appointments that they just, physically are unable to make, being put on payment plans that they just can't afford. We need to, stop chasing these folks for repaying those pandemic benefits that we know were so critical in those early days of the pandemic. We need to make sure that income security programs like the disability benefit, the current Canada Child Benefit, are available to everybody. There's barriers for certain groups to access those benefits. Right now, Canada Child Benefit is tied to arbitrarily to immigration status. So if somebody can be here working legally, but waiting for the federal government to make a recommendation around their immigration status, and it can take years, and they may even have Canadian-born children. They're working, they're paying their income taxes, and they're not eligible for the Canada Child Benefit. So we need to make sure that those unintended, oftentimes arbitrary policy barriers are not there. And we've got a bunch of those in our report card that we've been putting forward to the federal government. And then thinking about what other jurisdictions are doing, the other program that we're recommending and piece of research that we're recommending is for non-tax filers. So how do you broaden the income tax system and through community-based clinics and going into First Nation reserves and working with people and getting them into the tax system, but it will never be universal. There will always be people with mental health issues, no fixed address, expired SIN, distrust of federal institutions, whatever the reasons. So how do we create a parallel income eligibility and distribution process? We have tons of informal community-based programs like that throughout Canada. And there are a lot of formalized programs all across the country, all across the world, in lots of different jurisdictions that have been evaluated and shown to reduce poverty for very marginalized, very rural, remote families, mothers, and children. And so how do we create research and create a parallel distribution system for people who will fall outside of our personal income tax system? Thanks.
Thank you for all of that wealth of knowledge there around the barriers, Leila. We are very short, we're essentially out of time, but I'm going to just invite Jennifer to finish off for us if you have any final comments to add.
Sure, just really briefly, I think two things that, and I think Michael's context was so important. And as we move into the actual implementation and delivery of something like a disability benefit and other programs, I would just say that we need to take more of a functional needs approach, moving away from kind of diagnostic driven eligibility, which is kind of what dominates a lot of provincial and federal programs currently. So, there are examples internationally where, there's another layer on diagnosis that gives understanding of functional needs, which is, I think, the direction we have to go. Unfortunately, that's going to require kind of development of new criteria, I think. So that's not necessarily a fast process, but it's a super important process to go through. On the point on caregiving, I would just say, and a shout out to a postdoctoral fellow that works in the group, Stephanie Chipper, who's on the call. There's a lot of private insurance and court litigated cases where damages are awarded to families, and they can provide care and compensate family members for provision of care. So there's a lot of inequities between how we design public funded caregiving supports relative to kind of court litigated cases. And so thinking about sort of the disconnect that happens between how we often don't allow family members to be compensated for providing care, I think fundamentally needs to be addressed in sort of caregiving policies going forward.
Thank you. Yeah, that's interesting and an area I wouldn't have thought to look when I say to look to other jurisdictions, but even within our own system, we should look to those kind of cases and see how that is impacting is when they are able to get a more holistic support package and do things in ways that work for their family. We are really over time, and so I think I'm going to have to wrap it up. I am so grateful to all of you, and I do hope that you'll join us after the conference. We will plan to have some more conversations like this and work towards recommendations. So I really hope you will all join us. Thank you so much. And I am passing it back to Amanda F. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just some gratitude for our panelists as they depart the Zoom spotlight. This is Amanda Fenton speaking, everyone. We did paste the Menti link in the Zoom chat a little bit earlier, but we want to just, again, hold a couple of minutes to really give you the chance to offer some contributions, some thoughts in what do you want to add to this discussion about income supports? It might be barriers to programs that you see or are thinking about that maybe weren't mentioned or that you want to amplify. Perhaps some impactful policy changes that could bring equitable support in this important discussion about income supports. So the Menti link for that is in the Zoom chat. You could also welcome to use, just type in the Zoom chat as well, but we'll just pause. I'll play a little bit of quiet background music for those brains that enjoy that, just to give us a moment to welcome your contributions in that Menti. So pausing to type away or speak away in the speech to text world. What do you want to add to this conversation about income supports? Just a couple of minutes of quiet. Pause the music there. If you're still typing, still thinking, percolating, the Menti does not close. So you're welcome to still take a few more minutes. If there's anything that you'd like to contribute, I'll just read in. There were a couple that did arrive. I love the idea of caregivers getting paid for their time, caring for their loved ones, especially if this care means they cannot work. Another person added, just such important discussions, nothing to add, a fantastic event. And another offering that income support programs need to allow transition between systems. When I was transitioning to university from high school, I was kicked off of said benefits so that, you know, falling in between the cracks of programs. And a few in the chat that the system seems to depend on families not connecting, that income supports are not equal, and that parents are finding each other, comparing and planning in their spare time. So thank you for just lifting in, speaking in, be able to hear from the big room, not just our panelist voices. I'm going to pause there, and I think I'm just going to check in with Amanda Lockridge. We want to go to Kelly again. Is that true? True story?
That's true.
If Kelly is up for it, I can see their, there they are. I can see their beautiful graphic recording there. So Kelly, give us a little recap on what was cooking in the drawing world from that last panel. So a few minutes to hear from you.
I feel like mostly me, I'm cooked. And just like big love to everybody who is a part of contributing this conversation. So we left off thinking about this critical timing and expanding the conversation, and just feeling like there's a lot of really important elements coming together and growing and transforming just even in this conversation. And so I was really struck by somehow this emerging idea that as a result of just this time together that we probably won't ever be able to replicate again, that better ways are growing. And so we left off, and I'm just thinking about this, maybe it's because spring is very much here in a hot way where I am, but this income supports and perspectives and experiences conversation, all kinds of flowers and fruits and things coming up in here, sort of in the roots of it all and in what needs to kind of fertilize at a soil level. I have this trauma-informed policy making in underneath this seeded piece. And then just sort of what flowered from so much of the conversation is many interconnected parts, many complex parts. I'm trying to think of maybe where it started exactly. But just continuing to honor just this bigger theme of there's a deep connection of rates of poverty and disability for families and for all. And that in sort of this equation, this quantification, a market basket measure approach, not all disability needs are covered or currently honored in this basket, that it needs to expand to include more data and more needs. Let's see. To continue this piece of embedding access and inclusion from a rights-based perspective or lens that came up in the previous discussion, and just to weave that, some of the things that were popping up were around the UN Convention of Rights as an important lens to guide principles forward. To know that currently policy can actually be barriers and create harm, even when inclusion is in the language, and this ongoing work that needs to be done to reduce barriers through both data and just on the ground experience. We know that the needs are not being met despite families really stepping in to provide so much of the support for daily living, which makes some of the interesting data over the past couple of years is that emergency benefits and the way that benefits went into families during COVID provided significant help and a boost for families. And now we're seeing sort of some of that slipping away and seeing increased need. So there needs to be easy access to benefits to families and to many people again. And so this work around centering principles through the amendments to Canada's Disability Act as a law are really important to consider. Adequacy was the word that was used. So unmet needs, intersectionality, poverty, and human rights lenses, which might be taking time. But one of the other considerations also needs to be this holistic support that maybe compensates families, because as we see, they're providing so much need. And that's just also in the design of current programs in terms of disability tax credit, the way it leaves out people who are falling through the cracks. There are access barriers and low uptake rates for certain groups, both in terms of geography and in terms of how they identify. And so moving past that and continuing, and this theme of expansion is currently it's a functional needs approach, or we need to move towards a functional needs approach and not just a diagnostic need for that. So here are some seeds and a little bit of what's growing out of the conversation and some snippets around what are the things that better ways are growing, that can be growing, and that there are some, policy and bigger picture leverage points in which have been lifted up for us to be able to do some advocacy and some work, or encourage those who do that on our behalf to really be a part of the conversation. As we say in my language, in Haida territory, Hawa, merci beaucoup. And I think that's all I can think of in my little
No, Clecco, Kelly.
That's a very formal way of saying you have tremendous honor. Chew.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Kelly. And just really appreciating all the extra load your concussed brain is doing in your heart and your mind, and just for sharing. For Amanda and Brenda early in the conference planning, they really wanted to bring in art and beauty and dance and song. And so your work is not only an important artifact that helps, that will travel after today, but also brings in some of that art and beauty. And Kelly, what will happen is they will photograph that full image and it will be available to us. So we'll be able to zoom in and sort of revisit it, the parts that maybe help us remember important bits from this. So stay tuned for that. I think we're going to move into our closing now. And just by way of helping us shift into that, please, in the chat, just inviting everyone, if there is a word, maybe more than one word that you would really like to share, just to help us close this first day well. We started in such a meaningful way. We also want to close in a meaningful way. So if there is a word, a couple of words that you would love to offer in closing for this day one, please do that. The chat is open for you. And I'll turn it over to Amanda Lockett, who's going to give us some juicy tidbits, some previews of tomorrow, maybe. Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you, Amanda. This will be, it'll be sad to stop working as the Amandas. I first of all just want to thank the truly wonderful speakers and panelists that we had today. The depth and the breadth of knowledge and passion and interest is why Brenda and I wanted to put this together in the first place. So thank you for making our dreams come true. It has really gone above and beyond what we thought when we sort of said, hey, why don't we try and do a conference? So this does end day one of Childhood Disability Without Poverty, a national discussion. I really hope that you did find it as electrifying and edifying as I did. We do have another day of amazing guests and panelists and panels, including tomorrow we will be learning from families. We will look at disability and health-related supports, and we'll be looking at what's happening in other jurisdictions, including outside of Canada. We also have a special musical guest who delivered a wonderful video to us. They are Rattle and Strum from Calgary, so we're going to start the day off with some music and dancing. We figured it was a Saturday morning, maybe, pulling those kids away from cartoons, if kids still watch cartoons. I don't even know if that's a thing anymore. And joining us for some joy and some movement and some dance and some family time to connect and be all together, having fun. And I'm shocked and surprised to say this, but we are actually ending a little early today, which never happens. Yeah, thank you to you all, and we will see you 9 a.m. PD time tomorrow.